Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Inebriated Past with Matt Christman. Today, I am going to be talking about something that is a little outside of my purview. The previous editions of the Inebriated Past have very specifically and intentionally focused on American history. This is the first Inebriated Past to get outside of the confines of American history and outside of the confines of narrow historical analysis and narrative, actually. And that is to answer the kind of broad question that has dogged a lot of people in the last few years, especially since Trump took office, which is, what is fascism? What the fuck do people mean when they say fascism? This is a question that has bedeviled people and has led to a number of incredibly facile and disingenuous motherfuckers on the right attempting to make arguments about fascism being some sort of leftist force, fascism being some sort of subsidiary form of socialism. I mean, Jonah Goldberg, Dinesh D'Souza, everyone who gets mad at Antifa, they're all singing from the same hymnal, which is that fascism is essentially the same as socialism, because I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's a little thing called the horseshoe theory, which says that at the extremes, all political movements are identical. It's only in the meaty center of the horseshoe that there's real nuance. This is, of course, horseshit, but it is often easy to forget exactly why it's horseshit. And so what I hope to do with this episode is to drill down into the historical reality of fascism and talk about what it means to be fascist. And more importantly, even than debunking the bad faith arguments of a bunch of complete fraudulent assholes on the right, to discuss what fascism means in the 21st century and the degree to which the current moment in America and in Europe is defined as fascist and what that means. Basically, what fascism means after World War II. Because that's really where the question becomes meaningful. Everyone on earth understood what fascism was before the end of World War II. Before the end of World War II, everyone understood that fascism was a mutation, a hyper-aggressive variant of reaction that attempted to suppress the left through internal and external violence. Everyone understood that. It was not really a question. No one would argue the opposite. It was only after the end of the war, it was only after the Nazis and the Italian fascists had been defeated and the Imperial Japanese had been defeated that people could say, well, okay, what does fascism mean now? And have that question have a variety of answers. Because that's the most interesting thing to me about the question of fascism in the 21st century, is that as much as we historically literate people might scoff at the Jonah Goldberg, Dinesh D'Souza argument that liberalism is fascism, there is a left case to be made that they're actually right, for the wrong reasons, of course, but that they are essentially correct in pointing to sort of the Keynesian warfare state of NATO and post-war America as a variety of fascism. And we'll get to that. But anyway, the way to start to this is to go back to the beginning, to get back to where fascism began. It began with genocide and with concentration camps, but not in Poland and in Eastern Europe, as we've generally had been taught to us. It began in Namibia in 1904 through 1908. Which was the period when a rebellion by native Africans against the German colonial powers of what at the time was known as German Southwest Africa, and which is now considered called Namibia, led to a campaign of racial extermination that in its particulars is eerily similar to what those same Germans did 30 years later. The basic narrative here is that in the 1880s, Germany, one of the last European piglets to huddle next to the sow's teat of the scramble for Africa, grabbed this chunk of Southwest Africa, which is, as I said, now Namibia, north of current-day South Africa, an area that was 1.5 times the size of Germany, but compared to the holdings of, say, even Portugal or France or England, was relatively paltry because Germany was sort of the last European power to sort of grab a colonial chunk of Africa. So in the 1880s, Germany grabbed this one chunk of southwestern Africa as their part of the general colonial dissection of that continent. And they carried out the classic colonial playbook. That area of Africa was largely dominated by pastoralists, by herdsmen, by people who were members of several different tribes. The most notably were the Herero and the Nama tribes, whose subsistence was predicated on herding mostly cattle. And when the Germans showed up, they did what colonialists did, which is they grabbed the land and they grabbed the cattle. And they extorted control of the locals through debt peonage and just confiscation of livestock. And that went on for about 20 years until 1904, when there was a general rebellion against German colonial rule, which was responded to by Germany. At this point, what is known as the Second Reich, not the Third Reich of Hitler, but the Second Reich, the short-lived German Empire of the Kaisers that followed the Franco-Prussian War and lasted until the end of World War I. They responded with a campaign of genocide, flatly stated. They drove the rebellious Hereros into the desert, where many of them, most of them, died of thirst and starvation intentionally as a project of the German state. We have the quotes from the architects of this campaign who called it a racial war, who intentionally drove the rebellious Africans into the desert with the idea that they would starve and that they would be dehydrated to death. Where there were watering holes, the Germans poisoned them. And the people who survived these deprivations were gathered into concentration camps. These were not the first concentration camps of the modern era. Those, of course, were in Cuba, administered by Spain, and in South Africa, administered by the British during the Boer War. But shortly after that, so basically this is the third instance of concentration camps during the late colonial era in Europe of European conquest. And not only were the people who were rounded into these concentration camps allowed to die of exposure, of disease, of lack of food and water, they were experimented upon medically in a way that would be incredibly familiar to anyone who has studied the Nazi concentration camps. German doctors in German Southwest Africa conducted experiments on the captive populations of Hereros and Nama who were captured and held in concentration camps in Namibia, modern Namibia, in 1906, 1907, 1908. This is before fascism came to Europe. The reason I say this is because I think the best way to understand fascism is as the application of colonial coercive mechanisms of control and of domination to the metropole. I think that is what fascism most, I guess I'd say, fruitfully can be described, because there's a lot of different descriptions, explanations. And I think the best way to think of it is when a colonial power responds to pressure and conflict from within, either class-based or due to economic instability, or the mingling of those two, it brings the forces that it had used to subdue its colonial outposts to the center. I think that is what fascism most meaningfully is defined as. There are other elements of it. We can talk about Umberto Eco. We can talk about Stanley Payne. We can talk about Robert Paxton. I think Paxton is actually very, very helpful on this point. But I think to cut through all of the bullshit, to cut through all of the myriad obfuscations and acts of rhetorical legerdemain that go into the rhetoric around fascism, I think the way to think of it as colonial power, colonial systems of control being turned inward. So the first sort of example of this is what colonial Germany did in Africa in the 1910s in what is now Namibia. This is a time when no one would have referred to the German Reich as fascist. This is, in fact, a period when no less a figure than W.E.B. Du Bois saw the German Reich as a model for enlightened administration. This is basically just an expanded version of the Prussian bureaucratic state that Hegel saw as the end result of the historical dialect. So this is the epitome of European civilization. And it was carrying out in Africa what is absolutely recognizable in the modern mind as genocide, as the sort of depraved, lunatic violence of fascism. Fascism, first and foremost, was a response to World War I. World War I was a continent-wide bloodletting on a scale that was frankly unimaginable to anyone who had come before. The closest thing that you could compare it to is maybe the 30 Years' War of the 1620s through the 40s. And that even had the patina of sort of religiosity around it. There was nothing sacred about the First World War. There was no way that anyone involved in it could convince themselves that they were embarking in a holy crusade on anyone's behalf. It was brutal and horrible realpolitik that resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of young European men. A bloodletting that had basically never been conceived of before. A situation where you saw bright-eyed aristocratic hussars astride chariots of glory being mowed down mercilessly by Maxim guns. A situation where all of the prestige and honor of warfare that had persisted in Europe all the way through the Napoleonic era and everything was just chopped into nothing by mustard gas and by trench warfare and artillery shells. And the trauma of that war is something that is hard to really conceive of because we all live in its aftermath. We all live in a world created honestly by the basic trauma of World War I. These people who were alive at the time were introduced into the modern world basically in the most violently horrible way possible. And what it led to was a continent of Europe that was basically traumatized from stem to stern, and that led to people seeking extreme answers to the questions created by this war. So let's go through the two countries that became fascist, quote unquote, after World War I. Other countries can be brought into what we consider the Axis powers during World War II. Japan, of course, but also Romania and Hungary and Spain and Portugal. These are all, to one degree or another, can be put into the fascist orbit. But really only two countries after World War I were seized by political movements that we can point to and say, this is fascism. This isn't just reaction. This is not just the old guard trying to reassert power through a veneer of popular support. This is a new political formation that we can identify as fascist. Those countries were Italy and Germany. Italy and Germany were ostensibly on opposite sides of the Versailles Peace of 1919. Germany, of course, was the pariah state that had been defeated by the Allies in World War I and were considered by the Versailles Treaty to be the cause of the war, who were required to give massive indemnities, who were required to demilitarize, who were required to give over huge percentages of their industrial economy to the Allies. Italy had started the war on the Axis side, but had switched. They did a classic face turn in the middle of the war and ended up fighting with the Allies. Poorly, I must say. They got their asses kicked. They're basically the only people. The Italians were the only army in World War II, or World War I, rather, I'm sorry, that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians actually beat. Like, they kicked their ass. What they shared was a sense of being injured by the peace, by Versailles. Obviously, we know how Germany was insulted. The indemnities, the loss of the demobilization of the Ruhr, the lack of ability to have an army, the requirement of admitting war guilt. It was a stem to stern humiliation. Italy's humiliation was less overt, but still deeply felt, because Italy went into the war on the side of the Allies with the idea that by joining the winning side, they would gain the spoils of victory. But the Versailles Treaty didn't really give Italy much in the way of reward for having participated on the side of the Allies. And that feeling was deeply stinging to the people who had pushed Italy into joining the war, who had said, Italy, fight the war, it'll be worth it. One of the people who made that argument during the war was a former socialist named Benito Mussolini, who split with the Italian socialists on the question of the war, who said, I believe that it is Italy's destiny to fight this war, win it, and to gain spoils from it. And by doing that, Mussolini essentially divorced himself from the mass of the Italian socialist movement. And he emerged after World War II basically as a man without a country. But the country he was in was one that felt deeply insulted by their lack of territorial gains, and, like many of the countries of Europe and the rest of the world after World War I, economically dislocated by the war. Italy was a classic case of a country that had a uneven development. The south of Italy was largely agrarian and almost even quasi-feudal. North of Italy was a burgeoning industrial hub, which meant that you had a situation where Italy was in the southern Italy was dominated by the remnants of feudal orders, and northern Italy was rapidly industrializing, and with that industrialization came the realities of a modern society and class conflict, strikes, labor organizing, militancy. And into this ferment came Mussolini, the former socialist who made a deal, essentially, with the landed gentry of the South and the industrial magnates of the North, which was, allow me to deal with this. And the early power of the Italian fascist movement came in their ability to break strikes, both in the North among industrial laborers and in the South among agricultural laborers, because agricultural militancy was a feature of post-World War I Italy. The fascists made their efficacy shown to the powers that be by organizing street power in opposition to the left. And this is where we get to the real definition of fascism. And that is this is what Robert Paxton in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, which I highly recommend to anyone listening to this, says. It is the suppression of the left amidst popular enthusiasm. Because this was the central problem for the ruling powers of European countries after World War I. It was that the ineffable and unstoppable force of popular mobilization, popular political organization, meant that the old days of limited suffrage, of voting being only amongst the elect, only amongst the landowning, was no longer tenable. Everyone was going to get the ballot. And if everyone got the ballot, then Marx's calculation was going to be correct, because Marx saw in the expansion of the franchise essentially the doom of capitalism. He saw if the working class got a say in government, their numbers would eventually overwhelm the numbers of bourgeois and the numbers of landowners and take over control of governments across the whole world, wherever this reality of universal franchise pertained. This was a problem for the landowners, for the capitalists, obviously. And men like Mussolini and later Hitler came along and solved that problem for them. And this is another essential reality of fascism that must be remembered by anybody who wants to understand it, is that it was a postmodern movement. It was a movement of people who wanted power above all. Before fascism, politics and political parties were understood to represent specific class interests. Even people who hated Marx, even people who despised the concept of socialism, understood politics and political parties as a battle of interests. In the emergent democracies of Europe, there were farmer parties, labor parties, bourgeois parties, and they contested on the electoral battleground. And the ruling class despaired of their lack of numbers, because to them, the only way to understand politics was to understand it in these terms, in the terms of numbers, in the terms of interests. Fascism in Italy and in Germany was the product of people like Mussolini and Hitler, who understood that they could marry the rabble-rousing popular energy of the left with the economic and social support of the ruling class to create essentially an unbeatable combination. And this saw its first fruits in 1922 in Italy, when Mussolini led the March on Rome, when his black shirts, which is what he called his street fighters who had made their bones after World War I, beating up strikers and lazy farm workers all throughout Italy, and gaining the support and economic backing of landowners and industrialists, marched them. Mussolini marched his black shirts into the heart of Rome. And the king, Victor Emmanuel, responded by offering Mussolini the prime ministership. Now, there was nothing making him do this. They could have suppressed the March on Rome easily with the army if the ruling classes of Italy thought there was any other force that could be effective in suppressing the popular ferment created by the end of World War I, the demands of the peasants, the demands of the industrial workers. But there wasn't. There were only these black-shirted thugs literally marching into Rome and saying, "We are here to do your bidding." And so, instead of firing upon them and dispersing them and arresting them, the king and his supporters and the Catholic Church and the industrialists and the landowners gave him the portfolio of governance. And this created the first fascist government in history, something that Mussolini called corporatism, the bringing together of workers and ownership and landowners and peasants into one corporate body. Fascism essentially conceives of society as a body. It says that every class is an organ or a part of a whole body, and that the body cannot survive without all of them together, but that they cannot also be overcome. Like the Marxist concept of a class of society, a society where the exploiters are overthrown and all that's left are workers democratically managing control of the economy. That's not possible. What's possible instead is a harmonious social corporate order where everyone is part of a body that functions together. So that was the idea of fascism. And that is why it was critical of capitalism, because capitalism, especially in this moment after World War I, when capitalism was seen by millions of people throughout Europe as not only the thing that had disrupted so much of their understanding of the social order, but led to World War I and the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, was a plague and needed to be contested and needed to be contained. And at the time, the main force arguing against that was the left, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist left. And what fascism offered to the bourgeois and ruling classes of Europe was a way to square the circle, was a way to banish the anxieties created by capitalist dislocation and by the exploitation of capitalism through channeling violence outward in the form of colonial expansion, and also by suppressing an internal enemy, which, of course, would reach its apogee with the Nazis and their scapegoating of Jews. So let's turn to Germany. Germany was in far more dire straits than Italy was after World War I. It was the loser. It was the pariah dog of Europe after World War I. It was the force that had been broken at Versailles, had been forced to give up its army, had been forced to give up a massive indemnity to the Allies, had been forced to admit war guilt, had been forced to hand over a demilitarized Ruhr Valley to the French, at the same time that it was suffering from a massive starvation caused by the blockade of the North Sea by the British. And in this moment, you saw a glimpse of a German socialist revolution. It started with the overthrow of the Kaiser in 1918. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had been predicated on a general European revolt. And there was a moment there where it looked like it was going to happen. It was after the Kaiser had been overthrown in 1918, and when a naval mutiny in northern Germany had spread throughout the country, and where radical socialists allied with the Spartacist movement and the independent Social Democrats, who had been opposed to the Social Democratic Party that had allied with the war effort and voted war credits, seized control of many cities and filled the streets of Berlin and demanded first the abdication of the Kaiser and then the overthrow of the bourgeois regime in Germany. There was a moment there where it really looked like the tipping point had happened, where the domino effect that was going to start in St. Petersburg and move all the way through Europe and to the United States and across the world was going to happen, because Germany really felt like it was the next domino that was going to fall. There were masses of army, mass people, strikers in the streets throughout cities all the way through Germany who were horrified by the war that had been inflicted upon them by the capitalists and wanted to create a new democratic socialist society that would never have that happen again. But that rebellion was put down by the normal Social Democrats, by the Social Democrats who had supported the war effort, and a collection of traumatized war veterans who were basically not willing to be demobilized, called the Freikorps or Free Corps, who were at the direct orders of the Social Democrats, sicked on the revolutionaries and massacred them en masse wherever they popped up their head. The whole years of 1919 and 1920 were a series, is essentially a whack-a-mole, where a city would come into rebellion, a spontaneous socialist rebellion against the regime, and then the Freikorps would be sent in to massacre them. These traumatized World War I veterans who basically only knew violence at that point, and they would massacre them. This is, if anybody is in DSA and they've ever wondered why some random Spartacist on Twitter says, "Oh, you killed Rosa," this is what they mean. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who'd been leaders of the Spartacist rebellion, were indeed tracked down by these Freikorps and murdered during the suppression of the rebellions. And this was done by the Social Democrats with the idea that revolution was too far a move. It was too radical. It was too drastic. Instead, we should work within the system. And what they created was the Weimar Republic, which they controlled off and on over the next decade or so, until Adolf Hitler and his National Socialists, national quote-unquote socialists, came to power in 1933. This is like the exhibit A for anybody who wants to say that fascism is actually socialism. It's that, well, the Nazi stands for National Socialist. Duh. And that's supposed to be the end of the question. That's supposed to be the end of the argument. Boom. Nailed it. It's socialist in the name. You're fucked. But Nazism can only be understood in the same context as Italian fascism, which is as a opportunistic, essentially, basically a postmodern political movement. A political movement that, instead of arguing from an ideological position, begins from a position of seeking power. For guys like Mussolini and Hitler, in the horrible, traumatic aftermath of World War I, when modernity had run aground and all it had produced was dislocation and horror and trauma, these men saw these broken husks and said, I can gather them together into a force that marries the street mobilization, the popular passion that had before this point only been the province of the left, with essentially reactionary economic and social models. That's what fascism was. And it worked brilliantly because it's so much easier to organize people when you have money on your side. That's been the problem for the socialist left and the communist left everywhere, is that who is funding any of this? And the answer is no one, because it doesn't pay. It doesn't pay to overthrow capitalism. So a unscrupulous figure like a Mussolini or a Hitler, or the people around either of them, who are willing to gesture towards the curtailment of the most rapacious elements of capitalism that inhibit people's lives, while also playing to reactionary themes and nationalism above all, because that is the most important part. And that is why anybody who tells you that National Socialism means that the Nazis were socialist is full of shit. It's that nationalism in the core countries above all. There's a separate question about nationalism and radicalism and socialism in imperial countries, in countries that have been colonized. In colonizing countries, nationalism is antithetical at its base to socialism. And the proof of that is World War I, when all of the socialist parties of Europe which had pledged themselves to internationalism, were members of the Second International, all dissolved their allegiances in order to endorse their specific country's call to war. An absolutely meaningless, idiotic, awful bloodletting that meant nothing to anybody. World War I, one of the stupidest and most brutal and sadistic jokes in human history. These quote-unquote socialist parties were willing to give up their international commitments in order to support it. So that is all you need to know about socialism and nationalism. In the imperial core, they're incompatible. Because what fascism is, above all, is it's capitalism's response to trauma and crisis. That's what happened in Italy. It's what happened in Germany. These were countries that were, after World War I, were in economically distressed situations that did not allow for the creation or maintenance of a social sphere, of a political debate. The failure of capitalism to deliver meaningful livelihoods to the people in Italy and Germany led those people to want to seek alternatives. The number one alternative was Soviet communism, which was being imported from Russia and which made a very clear pitch to the working people of Europe. You don't have to live this way. You can have livelihoods that are guaranteed if you overthrow your leaders. Capitalism had no response in traditional political models to this appeal, while they were failing to deliver. And that's the chief point, is that they were failing to deliver. It was Italy, after World War I, was a barely developed economy that was deeply riven by internal contradictions. And the Nazis did not become a meaningful power in Germany until the Great Depression. In the absence of a capitalist response to this leftist critique, the only way of salvation for the ruling classes of these countries was to embrace these cynical street brawlers who had married reactionary social forms to left-wing street organization. And that's what fascism was. Fascism was a way to square the circle, essentially, of popular conservatism in an era when capitalism was failing. We all know what comes after that, of course. The countries that won World War I and were able to weather the Great Depression by establishing a more stable relationship between capital and labor, got together with the Soviets and crushed fascism. So that answers the question of what fascism was historically, in my opinion. And I think that what has dogged us in the current moment is the fact that what fascism means after World War II is a much more slippery concept. It's much more difficult. For example, there is a left-wing argument that says that the military Keynesianism of the United States post-World War II to the present is essentially fascist. When you look at its violent repression abroad, with its suppression of domestic rebellions and domestic minority populations, I think that's a valid argument, honestly. But I feel like if you grant that argument, you're basically saying that Dinesh D'Souza, General Goldberg are right, and that the liberal state is fascist. The attempt to deal with the post-Great Depression capitalist order is by its nature fascist. And I think, as I said, I think there's something to that, but I also think that to say that is to basically define the term out of meaningfulness. Because if everything is fascism, if everything post-World War II, if the post-World War II order is fascist, then what does fascism mean? I feel like making fascism meaningful means identifying what we're talking about. And to me, what we're talking about is not so much a question of behavior, because, as I said, the pre-fascist Second Reich of Germany was doing concentration camps and genocide in Namibia 30 years before they were doing, the Nazis did anything. So that is not a meaningful concept. The meaningful concept to me is, when does it turn inward? When do the internal contradictions of a capitalist advanced economy become unsustainable and require this attempt to synthesize popular discontent with ruling class control? That is when fascism exists. Because the empire of the countries of pre-World War I Europe and the empire of the United States is willing to countenance astounding violence and horror outside of its metropole in the areas that it considers to be the frontier. I mean, our Keynesian welfare state in America carried out a massacre of somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 million people in Southeast Asia in the 1960s and 70s, and has killed maybe 1 million people in the Middle East since 9/11. That is the nature of an imperial power. Fascism is the political movement that arises to combat the internal contradictions that occur when the metropole, when the imperial core is no longer sustainable. And I feel like with Trump in the United States, and also Orban in Europe, in Poland, UKIP, Front National, we are seeing the reemergence of that same phenomenon of imperial core countries in Europe and the United States finding within themselves a irresolvable conflict created by the economic collapse of 2008 and 2009 and the resulting austerity. This is a world where those benefits, those of empire, that social democratic deal that had been given to workers, regular people in America and in Europe, is no longer tenable. The spoils of empire are no longer great enough. The frontiers of capitalism are restrained enough that there's nowhere else to gain new profit. Because for the longest time, the biggest knock on Marx from conventional economists was that his prediction that the rate of profit would decline was wrong. But in reality, that profit over time was found through colonial exploitation. And what we've seen in the 21st century is the first reality of a global market. There really is nowhere else on the planet that is not a part of the global capitalist market. So there's no more frontier to find new sources of exploitation, new sources of margin, of profit. We are in a closed loop. And now that we're in it, the rate of profit is declining. It has been since the 70s. And the only thing that's kept the capitalist economies of the West going has been these series of bubbles. Stock speculation in the 80s, tech speculation in the late 90s, and of course, real estate speculation in the late aughts. And now we are in the backwash of one of these collapses. And the rate of profit isn't going anywhere. All that's happening is that the capitalist powers of Europe and America, the West in general, are beginning to turn inward and have been for decades, actually. So since the 1970s, and only exacerbated by every economic downturn and super exacerbated by the 2008 collapse, the economies of the capitalist West in Europe and the United States have not only sought profit by hyper-exploiting the labor of workers in China and Bangladesh, Vietnam, and everywhere else, but also by eroding the standard of living of workers within the metropole, within the United States, within continental Europe. And by doing so, they have created the exact same set of reinforcing dislocations and pathologies that persisted in post-World War I Europe. And people are looking for answers. People in the fent-holler shithells of Middle America and in the deindustrialized regions of Europe are turning once again to the exact same sort of populist appeals, right populist appeals, that made up fascism in the 1920s and 30s. Trump in America, Le Pen, Orban, that fucking Doogie Howser bitch in Austria, all of those motherfuckers blaming problems on interior parasites. Because that's the main trick of fucking fascism that is true of the original fascism of the 20s and 30s and is true of this fascism. It is that the real infection is capitalism. And the scapegoat is always something else. It is always taking the real injuries committed to people, the real pain that people feel, and blaming it on an interior other. Jews in Germany, immigrants in our United States, Muslims in the creeping fascism of Europe. That is how the circle is squared. That is how popular enthusiasm, popular rage, righteous rage, I would argue, at an economic order that is exploitative and unjust, is married to reactionary social forms, is by blaming a scapegoat, pushing the blame away from the capitalist system that is actually responsible for all of these awfulness, all of this exploitation, all of this misery. And so that is what fascism is. Fascism is the attempt by cynical opportunists, and in the case of Donald Trump, genuinely idiotic reality TV show morons, abetted by cynical opportunists, to redirect popular discontent with an economic system that has exploited them towards scapegoats in the service of traditional centers of power. And the goal of leftist movements in this country and in every country is to disengage that mechanism. It's to break that feedback loop. It's to reintroduce class into the discussion. It is to demystify a rhetoric and a conversation, a social conversation that has totally forgotten what class means and what class impacts. The real upshot of all of this is that our only salvation comes through internationalism. Because nationalism, proscribing humanity by borders arbitrarily drawn, will inevitably lead to fascism. There is no such thing as nationalist socialism in the 21st century, in a global market. At one time there might have been, but now nationalist socialism is national socialism, is Nazism, is fascism. The only way that we're getting out of this predicament we're in right now is through international cooperation. It's by together dismantling the empire of European powers, of the United States, of redistributing wealth, of redistributing power to a global proletariat. That is the only way to counteract the narrow violence of imperial-inflected national fascism. Because if we are okay as a nation with plundering foreign countries, overturning democratically elected governments, massacring foreigners, drone striking people in order to maintain our neurotic sense of safety, then we will inevitably be okay with those same weapons being turned on us to maintain that same sense of arbitrary safety. Until we believe that every human being on earth is equal in dignity to every other human being on earth, we will be divided along these lines. We will be cosseted by bromides about national greatness and by national security and what we're owed, and sign off on devastation and bloodshed that will inevitably come home to us as the rate of profit continues to decline and as capital continues to seek any means of maintaining its hegemony.
Welcome, listeners, to another edition of Matt Christman's Inebriated Past. Not sure if this one should technically be called Intoxicated Past, but I'll leave that to the historians. So, today I want to talk about a subject that is incredibly important to understanding contemporary American culture, especially the political culture that we find ourselves basically trapped within, this nightmare realm where we're just dealing with the paranoid, clannish, irrational groupings that totally obscure the actual stakes of play in politics. And it's very frustrating. So I wanted to talk about that subject, and that is conspiracy theories. And I want to talk today about the history of conspiracy theories throughout America. From the dawn of the Republic and even before to now. And I feel like this will give us a good understanding of exactly where we are, why we're there, and what it says about our politics. So I'm saying this just to let you know that I'm going to be breaking this down into two chunks. First chunk will be a chronological description of the place that conspiracy theory is held in American culture throughout American history. The second part, I'm going to give some theories I have about conspiracy theories and how we should think about them. Now, I am doing a broad historical overview, but I think we need to remember that conspiracy theory culture, the kind that is relevant in the current moment, is very specifically grounded in late 20th century era of deindustrialization and mass media saturation. It doesn't really make sense to talk about conspiracy theories in the 19th century and conspiracy theories in the 21st, and they're not really referring to the same thing. And I think that needs to be remembered. But I'm still going to give the full overview just so you can see the way that the material reality changes things and kind of directs the flow of culture. And another point of clarification, when I'm talking about conspiracy theories and conspiracy theory culture, it's not necessarily contained within it all of the verified and understood machinations of the U.S. covert operations and intelligence communities. The assassinations, buggings, experiments on human subjects, all part of the record and all part of statecraft for 20th century and 21st century capitalism. And those things, I want to stress, are distinct from conspiracy theory culture and the narratives of the conspiracy theories, but are also integral to them. And when we talk later on in the chronological breakdown, we talk about the birth of the post-war conspiracy theory culture. I'll get more into what the connection is between the objective reality of covert operations and government secrecy and the fanciful conspiracy narrative that would be inspired in some cases by those real acts. So we'll get into that later. So if you're talking conspiracy theory culture in America, you have to start when there's a time of mass culture. So conspiracy culture in America can't really be thought of as a coherent thing until you have the mass newspaper culture of the early 19th century, which also brings with it a big ferment of things like Western expansion, the conflict over slavery, the rise of financial and industrial capitalism is very important, and shit was changing, and it was making people uneasy and disempowered. This is also the era of the rise of the Industrial Revolution, so people are finding themselves thrown off of the land and into uncertain, degrading work in the mechanic shops of the East Coast cities. There had to be some sort of party responsible for this. And as we know, this is an era before class consciousness really had begun to even twinkle into existence in such a nascent working class, right? So there is no such real thing as class consciousness or class understanding. There's just the yeoman farmers of America who think of themselves as all independent individuals, totally responsible for their own destiny. Government's only there to help them carry it out, finding themselves restricted in ways and having their lives disrupted in ways that they could not have fucking ever imagined. And that made them feel out of power. It made them feel powerless. And there was no way to understand that relationship because there was no language of class to express the mutual feelings of all the people suffering it. And so people had to come up with their own ideas. And during that early period, there were different fingers pointing at different places. Some people pointed at the Eastern bankers. Some people pointed at the slavocrats of the Southern aristocracy. And those all had some material basis. But there was one group that became an abstracted force for evil, causing all the other maladies in society. And those were the Freemasons. Now, the Freemasons, as anyone knows, are basically kind of a more pretentious Rotary Club, or like Kiwanis, like if the Elks Club like to get nude in the banquet halls, that kind of thing. It's just a kind of frou-frou, more self-consciously sort of bourgeois version of of a fraternal organization. But the thing about it is that because they take the cream of the urban middle class, the people who made the first wave of revolutions in Europe, and from the French Revolution to the revolutions of 1848, that class having this group that they would get together and talk about politics, talk about improving man, creating this notion that man is to be improved and there can be a plan, like the plan of the Grand Mason, the architect behind everything, and that you can push something in that direction. And the fact that they tended to not be affiliated with traditional religious institutions, it made them incredibly suspicious. And in America, the spark that lit this wave of Masonic paranoia was the disappearance of a man in Western New York named William Morgan, who had been out and about claiming to have Masonic secrets he had learned inside the organization that he was going to tell the world. He was writing a book about the evils within Masonry that he had found by infiltrating them. And while he was on this campaign, he disappeared without a trace, and he was never found. And so the belief of many people in Western New York is that this was a case of this group murdering a man. He was the Seth Rich of the 1820s, okay? And the furor about his supposed death his alleged death became so frenzied that it actually led to the formation of a political party called the Anti-Masonic Party. It was formed in upstate New York in 1828, and it was a single-issue party, and the issue was destroying the power of the Masons, which they claimed was behind all other powers in the country and responsible for all the ills of the country. And what's so interesting about it is that it really did graft people's pre-existing material hostilities onto a narrative that made sense of them. The Masonic Party didn't last very long. It only was around for a few years. It won a few local seats, but it collapsed shortly after that. Many of the people from the Anti-Masonic Party ended up joining the Whigs, and from the Whigs became the basis for the Republican Party. In fact, one of the chief founders of the Anti-Masonic Party, Thurlow Weed, you want to talk 19th century names, Thurlow motherfucking Weed, later became the chief advisor and aide to William Seward, who was the preeminent Republican politician, governor of New York, and came in a close second to Lincoln for the 1860 Republican presidential nomination. So this guy was the line from the anti-Masons to the Republican Party that overthrew slavery is a straight one, because a lot of those people were abolitionists, and they saw in the Masons the hand of the slaveocracy. And so they were able to make sense of it that way. Others might have seen, just Eastern capital as being the force that the Masons represented. Either way, it became a locus of anti-Southern and specifically anti-Jacksonian politics in upstate New York, because Jackson was well known to all at the time a Mason, much like the founding fathers had all been, and because his style of government had been so alienating to his opponents, because he was so high-handed by dissolving the Bank of the United States by fiat, basically, that they called him King Andrew. And the idea of him being this wannabe dictator was very strong. So the idea of this guy representing this ancient, shadowy organization as president was very tempting to people in the North. In fact, the party that ended up rising to oppose Jackson's Democratic Party, the Whigs, named themselves after the faction in the British Parliament that was opposed to the king's prerogative. I mean, that was a self-conscious attempt to say we are against kingly government. And so King Andrew became this figure that alienated many across the country, and they saw behind him some evil force. And for people in the burned-over districts, the righteous second great awakened districts of upstate New York, it was the Masons behind him. It was the godless Masons. So that was the first expression of conspiracy theory as a cultural element of American culture. All right. So now, a lot of these anxieties and hostilities that were represented in the Anti-Masonic Party, they ended up getting resolved by a little thing we like to call the American Civil War, in which slavery was paid to as an issue of national division. And as a result, conspiracy theory kind of broke off into just, the culture of a country literally riven by civil conflict, which you could argue is sort of the end state of any culture that is getting neurotically obsessed with conspiracy theories. But that's another idea, and one that we probably shouldn't think about too hard without getting bummed out. So conspiracy theory really re-enters the larger cultural conversation in the post-World War II era of the first Red Scare, because the Victorian era had been the process of the American working class coming into its own, going from this scattered organization of greasy mechanics and mudsills who had made up this unorganized working class around the era of the anti-Masons. After the Civil War, the rapid industrialization and capital accumulation created this supercharged environment whereby class consciousness emerged very quickly, and you had a huge explosion in labor militancy all throughout that era, from the Knights of Labor to the American Federation of Labor to 8-hour workday protests, massive actions like the Homestead Strike, the Pullman Strike, the bloodiest history of labor conflict in the West of any country in Europe or North America for sure, and of industrial unionism anyway. And so there wasn't really a space for conspiracy theories because instead everybody was pointing their head in the right direction. Everybody could see the hand of capital at work in their lives and were combining to try to defeat it. So conspiracy theory was sort of squeezed out of the marketplace of ideas. It was only when the first Red Scare, though, when this rising tide of socialism, which by that point there was a socialist party that was contesting elections. Gene Debs got over 1 million votes running for president. And then you had the IWW, this model, this syndicalist model for industrial unionization of the entire American working class, and then the creation of a single revolutionary general strike. I mean, that was really something that was on the agenda in these guys' middle-term aspirations. And then you had, the business unionism of the AFL getting concessions from management through negotiation. So this huge tide had to break against something, and in America, thanks to the Russian Revolution and the general reactionary nature that is of culture that is unleashed by warfare, in this case, fighting World War I, they were able to take that energy and use it to scaremonger people about this enemy within that needed to be wiped out. This scary foreign radicalism that had nothing to do with American culture or American people, was imported from outside, not part of us, certainly not a product of our horrible industrial exploitation. No. An evil alien infection. And the answer for who's spreading this infection is where conspiracy theory comes in. It is where you create grand narratives out of scant actual information, begin to make inferences not based on anything's logical connection to itself or the next thing in the chain, but rather how you think it connects it to a grander narrative. So evidence doesn't have to make sense. It's connecting disparate evidence based on your idea of what you're working backwards. I'll put it this way: you're working backwards from a conclusion. That's what conspiracy theory logic is. You say these people are responsible for this, and then how can I prove it? You backward fill your information, and that's the nature of the beast. And so during this Red Scare, the narrative that a lot of people in America grabbed onto, and it was one that was very popular in Europe and had been for centuries, is that it was the Jews. It was a conspiracy of the Jews to destabilize and undermine Western civilization. If this sounds any way familiar, please stop me. There were very out and proud public faces for this point of view. Henry Ford, the goddamn Steve Jobs of his day, was out there promoting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, requiring the sales of his newspaper, The International Jew, in Ford dealerships. This is like if your iPad came preloaded with the Turner Diaries. That's what this is like. It's fucking insane. And you also had popular cultural figures like Father Coughlin, the Catholic priest who pointed to the Jewish origins of Bolshevism. But the real magic, though, comes in that, so as the Great Depression sets in, everyone's material condition is getting worse. They can see that their institutions aren't working for them, and they know why. So they are alienated from the economy, and they are alienated from capitalism because they see all it does is immiserate them and exploit them to no gain. But they cannot accept the leftist notion that means capitalism is to blame or that we need socialism, because they've too deeply associated that with this alien other. There has to be another explanation. And so the most popular one, conceived of by folks like Coughlin in the United States, folks like Hitler in Germany, was the unified field theory that fascism created, that said that both Bolshevism and finance capitalism were both controlled by Jews, that the war between them was a phony one meant to undermine Gentile white societies and destroy them from within. It doesn't make any sense, obviously. What is in it for the Jews to destroy the entire material reality that they've built and benefit from? Where is it to their benefit to destroy the thing that creates wealth that they are the ones who control? Why would they do that? And there is no answer to that, because that's the key thing that conspiracy theories do, is that they give you an answer to the ineffable elements of cause and effect and of historical theory and of your understanding of the world. It's like, who can know the mind of the monster? Who can know? They're different than us. We can't conceive of what they could want to do. So that just offloads on us the responsibility of making our theory make sense. This contrasts with the Marxist analysis that says people on top want to keep being on top. They want to keep exploiting. They want to exploit resources to their benefit and to their exclusive benefit. And that all of their decision making is based on those incentives. I think that's a more plausible reason or explanation. But that one makes you have to confront capitalism head on, and they didn't want to do that for a bunch of reasons. Culturally and also materially, many of their class interests were with the ruling class. But so people who are squeezed by capitalism, they don't blame capitalism. They blame some manifestation of capitalism secretly controlled by Jews. And that is why August Bebel called anti-Semitism the socialism of fools, because it is someone expressing their alienation, but in an idiotic way and at the wrong target. So that's where the fascist theory of all explanations, which we see picked up now with alt-right guys and all this, like they're all picking up the same thread, which says that all the problems, back then it was communism and finance capital. Now it's Islam and finance capital. It's just the same nonsensical story. So that's where that came from. Was born after World War I in the need to break labor power in the United States, frankly. And they were largely successful to our great detriment. The union movement was set back a great deal, and it was only the Great Depression that allowed for rapid mobilization and the ability to extract reforms from capital. Okay, now all of that had to kind of get stowed for the big fight against the Nazis, which, according to a lot of these people who we were talking about earlier, were not the enemy we should have been fighting. But anyway, so there's a brief sort of cessation of hostilities during the Popular Front War against fascism. But of course, as soon as the war ends, the veil has to be brought back down with a vengeance. To the connective tissue between world communism and American labor movement has to be cut instantly, so that you get your second Red Scare. Talking John Birch Society blues. That's right. And this was America's just spontaneous, massive rejection of the New Deal and the Cold War sort of state of play. And eventually, over time, the civil rights consensus. But it started with a rejection of the New Deal, or an belief that the New Deal had gone as far as it needed to and needed to stop, which is why you had there was a huge strike wave after World War II, directly after World War II. 1946, 47, massive spike in strikes because there had been no strike pledges all through the war, and that had led to this buildup of tensions that all exploded at once. And this led to a huge reaction against the labor movement. And in 1948, there was a massive Republican wave election that gave the Republicans veto-proof majorities to pass the Taft-Hartley Act, which really was the thing that drove the stake in the heart of the American labor movement. It just took years and years for it to bleed out. But that was the political culture of the Red Scare. And in this immediate World War II aftermath, the Jews kind of had to go on the back burner as the villain. Anti-Semitism really took it on the chin with that whole Nazi genocide thing. So the Jews were the Jewish part of Judeo-Bolshevism went away, and it was just the Bolsheviks, and communists took over that position in culture as the evil force manipulating everything but from behind the scenes. There were some few hardcore dudes like the Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith, who kept it real, as it were, about anti-Semitism and how it was really the Jews responsible, and the Roman Catholics, of course, too, in trying to destroy American virtue. But this was the era of the John Birch Society, of fluoride in the water, the first chemtrails, and the belief that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist agent. So this is the paranoid style that Richard Hofstadter talked about in his seminal book. But this movement was, this strain of conservatism, according to the narratives of conservatives, was definitively destroyed when William F. Buckley publicly distanced himself from the John Birch Society, which, according to conservatives, ushered in an age of reason in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement. Obvious horseshit. I mean, come on. I don't have to tell you people how much horseshit that is, but that's what they said. Instead, that conspiratorial worldview, that seeking of an other to be responsible for all of the ills within society because there could be no contradictions within American society, that's the backbone of hostility to the liberal order among the disaggregated American reactionary middle class. Okay, so at this point, as you can see, conspiracy theory in the 20th century anyway has been broadly a reactionary movement. It's a movement of the right. It's a movement to make sense of social change by creating scapegoats because it can't confront the real heart of the problem, capitalism. So as a result of that, because of the strong labor movement in the United States, conspiracy theories on the left were relatively muted. People felt like, no, things work out in the open because look at us. We're changing the world with good old collective bargaining. But then the 60s happened, and a new strain of conspiracy theory thinking would now emerge on the left. The difference is that on the left, in this case, there are a lot of real things that happen, actual documented events that gave people a very justified sense of paranoia about what their government was capable of. And I'm not even talking about the big headline-making assassinations of JFK and RFK and MLK. And honestly, even if I am agnostic as to what happened in most of those cases, I have gut feelings, but I really don't feel comfortable making any kind of historical judgment on any of those big ones. But just think about how those things all happening that quickly in succession would make the average person feel like there's no way this is a coincidence. There's no way there are that many lone nuts that just spring out of nowhere to cut down the most prominent people on the left. That just doesn't make sense. So it's understandable. But then we talk about the smaller things that are not debatable, that actually happened. The murder of Fred Hampton by the FBI, COINTELPRO in general, the fucking MK Ultra. Okay, this is something that if somebody came out and said it happened now and we didn't know any better, it would sound like a complete fucking sci-fi goof 'em up. The CIA took fucking acid and it's exposed Americans to it in order to observe their reactions as part of a long-term brainwashing experiment to see how tractable the human brain was to suggestion and interrogation. That really happened. One part of it was called Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA rented out a bordello, put two-way mirrors in all the bedrooms, and paid sex workers to douse their fucking clients with LSD and then filmed the results. All of that happened in this time frame. And people didn't know about it all at once, but it's dribbled out ever since. And so this is when most of America was exposed to the real nature of covert operations, the real nature of what it is to be a superpower with a intelligence arm, and how it cultivates the garden of capitalism with just behind the back murder fests and sneaky dealings of all kinds. That's how it lubricates the gears of democracy. It's like covert ops are the lube in the piston between capitalism and democracy, because democracy is necessary to give capitalism legitimacy, but democracy can't be allowed to actually threaten capitalism. And so that's why you prevent the friction from becoming too great by lubricating it with fucking special ops, with intelligence, with state propaganda efforts, covert assassinations, all that stuff. That is how you keep democracy in check. So that's where people get this first exposure. And it leads to a lot of meaningful revelations about the way the state works, but also, really understandably, gives people a desire for grand narratives of conspiracy which these smaller acts are just parts of. A desire to knit everything together into one satisfying story, which we all have. We've been trained to have it by what we observe in media all the time. This is also the first generation to get conspiracy culture expressed in popular media. This is this led to the 70s, in which you had such amazing, great conspiracy movies as Parallax View, the highly underrated Winter Kills, Executive Action, which is a movie where big Hollywood stars sit around tables and just plan the Kennedy assassination, released 10 years after that event. The fucking Capricorn 1, where they do the fake Mars landing to make the argument that actually it was a fake moon landing. And all of it anchored by a movie about a real fucking conspiracy, All the President's Men. So the 70s is when we get leftist and broad pop culture conspiracy theory as part of the American cultural conversation. And of course, like all culture did, conspiracy theory moved hard right in the 80s, thanks to a little thing we like to call the Satanic Panic. So in the 1980s saw a Reaganite reclamation of American culture from these effete libertines who had become dissipated and perverse. But that led to anxiety. If we are the good homespun folk, how have we been allowing our vital roles as parents to be supplanted by mass media figures from the West Coast and strangers who we give our kids to in terms of the people that we have raised our children? Because the 80s, of course, saw the contraction of possibilities for working class people, the rise of two-earner households where both parents had to work, and that meant kids being sent to daycare facilities. So you don't have influence over your children the way you used to, both in terms of where they spend the day and what they're consuming, because of a popular culture that is not created by anyone that you recognize as having the same values as you. And so the Satanic Panic emerges as a alienation of all of that anxieties into one force. In this case, it's satanic cults, massive satanic cults that in some of these theories and in some of these court cases, because in a lot of cases, bogus accusations of sex abuse at daycare centers led to massively popular, in terms of media attention, trials in which these incredibly outlandish claims were put out, including the idea of nationwide satanic networks of people ritually abusing children, flying on private jets to special sex islands. I mean, if you don't recognize the parallels to QAnon and Pizzagate, then you're a little slow on the uptake. I'm sorry. That is the template that we're going to later see come back with QAnon and with Pizzagate. But it reflects some of the same anxieties about not being the person who influences your children, who guides and protects them. Your sense of feeling powerlessness as a parent. That's what it boils down to. So these tales of children being abducted and abused to please Satan. Another case where the motive is obscured by ideology, in this case, and spirituality. This idea that Satan wants only for our destruction. He has no positive agenda. He has no goals for himself. He only wants the destruction of humans and the suffering of humans. Well, then that's not a world that's recognizably ours, because in our world, people do things for their benefit. But there is no benefit when Satan's doing things, because he's just making humans suffer. So once again, we're denying the material roots of actions and creating this eternal being to come down and determine our lives for us. So I'm getting now to my absolute favorite period of conspiracy theory history, the greatest, the golden age. I will not hear anyone else argue otherwise. You can spare me with your kitschy John Waters-esque 50s Red Scare shit. Even the Satanic Panic, I tip my hat to that's particularly just grand ghoulian ghoulishness on TV every day. I mean, amazing. But to me, nothing beats the 90s. Tinfoil hats at the end of history. This is where conspiracy theory as culture came into its own. Because the 90s were, as I have said before, the last decade in American history. We don't have decades anymore. It's just a smear of things happening. Differentiation has been abolished by the speed of capital acceleration. We're just falling towards the black hole of capital and stretching out, and it all is just blurring together. So the 90s are the last decade, and it was a time when we thought that orderly, sequential time was going to go on forever. It was the triumph of neoliberal capitalism. It was the banishment of all external enemies. The USSR was gone. There was no more bad guy, no wolf at the door, no bear at the door, rather. And that we were in charge of our destinies as Americans and as capitalists and as Christians. And this was all summed up by a phrase uttered by President George H.W. Bush, a dawning of a new world order. And those words just set off like a tuning fork in the heads of millions of mostly white American males, who felt the walls closing in when they heard that, who felt that actually we are now being corralled. There's no escape from any of these institutions. There's no escape from this present. So that means that we are being caged because we are losing our ability to choose anything other than what is being presented to us. And when you see something like NAFTA happen, where they spent years arguing for it, it was vastly unpopular. It was created by and conceived of by the Bush administration. And then after a contentious presidential election, his opponent wins, Bill Clinton, and then he promptly fucking passes NAFTA. The sense that that's got to create is that, oh, we're not in charge of any of this. This is on rails. And for these guys, especially guys who've been affected by this, maybe laid off by one of these factories relocating, this sense of an ending frontier, this sense of losing that American sense of personal freedom. And of course, this is all tied into white supremacy. I'm sorry. I mean, obviously, this is the frontier mindset of the Manifest Destiny generation. This is the Frederick Jackson Turner, go west, Horace Greeley ass idea that this is virgin land for the taking, that every man's right is his right to just set off one day and make his new fortune. And all of that is predicated on land being grabbed and exploited and expropriated from its owners, the native tribes, and then all the value being pulled from that land by enslaved labor, but full freedom for the white man. And that is a thread that goes through American culture to this day. And that sense was being very much threatened by that end of history feeling of the 90s. And so this creates a need to there be a narrative, a dramatic expression of this anxiety of encroaching capitalist hegemony. And so on the ground, you had things like the Michigan Militia. You had things like Ruby Ridge and Montana Militia. And of course, the fucking granddaddy of them all, Timothy McVeigh, a man who read the Turner Diaries and saw the Waco burnings and saw a government that was controlling every aspect of life and decided he was gonna fight back the way he'd learned to during the battle of during Operation Desert Storm. So that's what's happening on the ground. And then in culture, you see the rise of conspiracy entertainments like the X-Files, which is the definitive program of that decade, really. And in this decade, these cultural expressions of conspiracy mindset are centered around the figure of the alien. The alien has taken the place of the communist or the Jew or the Mason. The alien is the outside force manipulating human life for its own goals. Now, sometimes that is a thinly veiled allegory for Jews, as was the case, with the communists. But for a lot of people, aliens become this avatar of power, the avatar of the supernatural, almost technological and economic power that the governments and corporations of the world hold over you. That is the alien. And that finds its expression in things like X-Files and a bunch of movies about alien abductions that were very popular at that time. And you had folk understandings. This is the decade when words like black helicopter, ideas like crop circles and cattle mutilations, and the fear of FEMA camps all become part of common parlance. We all understand these references because that's conspiracy theory culture making its way into the mainstream. And all this language was created in the 90s by popular culture that fixated on this idea of an alien threat to more Baroque stuff involving reptilians or interdimensional beings or demons in some cases. All of these were expressions of that same anxiety. But this figure, the alien, he represents the important element of conspiracy theory is that it has a source of transcendence. It gives you an idea, a way to transcend this disenchanted world we live in. The same way that in the 80s Satan could. The alien represents a power beyond our understanding, which means the world is not as we see it, which means there is more possibility than we have been given, and that there is a hope for transcendence, that we can be beyond, that this isn't as good as that we can make it, that this isn't the only world that exists. And that's what the aliens represent. So this current, which has, it's really a tapestry of stuff. Aliens are one of the big motifs. Government, New World Order stuff is a main motif. But woven within that is just this amazing tapestry of different strains and ideas. The Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, a Bilderberger group, all of these just amazing tales. One guy, William Cooper, wrote this book, Behold a Pale Horse, that wove everything together, all of history, into this massive saga of alien infiltration and takeover of America, of world governmental institutions. And every single conspiracy theory is like a subsection of this greater tale. It's amazing. He would go on to be shot in a shootout with police 2 days after 9/11. So, who knows what that means? Draw your own conclusions. But all of this was powered by books, by radio, and by television. I was talking about X-Files, obviously. I'm talking about early internet websites. And of course, but the two guys that did it, one, Art Bell, who provide this beautiful oral soundtrack of alien abduction stories and tales from Area 51 and all these amazing paranormal firsthand accounts broadcast all night, all across the country. And then on screens, Alex Jones. It's hard to remember that now because he's now basically just a mega water carrier. But in those days, Alex Jones was just an electric mix of conspiracy theories that he just embodied this wholesale repudiation of the settled neoliberal order, for everything that meant. And it encompassed every element of reactionary and leftist disenchantment with the moment. So he could be everything to everybody because he encompassed all of these tales. And his greatest coup, and the thing that made him, I think it made him. I think it carried him through maybe the lean years of post 9/11 when he kind of had to just market himself as a truther kind of exclusively and limited his audience in a way. It's been his signature achievement. And I think it was what carried him through the lean years till he could become a branded figure like he is now. So one of the parts of the tapestry of conspiracy theory that all underlies these grand narratives of world order and humans being turned into livestock for some great unveiling and some great culling was the little get-together known as a Bohemian Grove. Bohemian Grove is a retreat in Northern California redwoods outside of San Francisco. Every summer, and this has been true since the late 19th century, titans of industry, finance, diplomacy, and government, and technology, and everything, the muckety-mucks, who you would think would be in charge of the world, come together for 2 weeks or a weekend of drinking, of sex, and most importantly, connections. The guys give each other little. It was almost like TED Talks before TED Talks, like TED Talks with the child sacrifice. They would just talk about different areas of their expertise to each other and make the connections that lubricate the upper realms of world economic and political power. And they've been doing that for over 100 years. Now, on its face, it's pretty absurd. These rich assholes getting together to just, in our face, hash out how the world's going to be divided up. But there's something also sort of banal about that, right? The idea that they can just do that. The idea they can just be like, yeah, we're going to get together. We're even going to tell you we're going to get together. We're going to come out of it and have gotten all of your lives' destinies. We've all swapped them like horses. we have that power over your life. That's kind of a bummer. Nobody wants to hear that. So what Alex Jones did to make Bohemian Grove a narrative that would pop and make him interesting and make people want to listen to him is by said, no, they don't just get together and hang out and make deals. They are doing satanic rituals involving child abuse, cannibalism, and sacrifice to evil gods. And that is what Bohemian Grove is about. And now you got to admit, that's a much more striking narrative. That's like, oh, wow. You know, it also gives you the idea that this is a movie and you could go in there and like find the evil god and like, you know, say the incantation and throw an amulet at him and he'd explode and go back to his own universe and the world would be saved. You know, there's a narrative there, which means there could be a happy ending as opposed to just this sad, brutal, out in its open expression of domination and confidence in the rule, which is what Bohemian Grove actually is. But the funniest thing is the motherfucker made good on it because he snuck in the late 90s, snuck onto the grounds of Bohemian Grove during the actual weekend with a camera crew and recorded an actual ritual sacrifice. Now, no one was killed, but what actually happened, and this is something that happens at the beginning of every Bohemian Grove get-together, is that there is a giant bonfire put at the base of a 20-foot tall stone owl named Mammon. They call it the cremation of care. And the idea is that they are coming here to have fun and they're burning up all of their troubles. And they're not going to bother them while they're in the woods. Now, the actual origin of this is that Bohemian Grove was created by a bunch of dandy theater folk in San Francisco who wanted to like put on a little fun thing. And it has all, and doing something like that has all the hallmarks of Ivy League fancy boys. It's the kind of shit they love to do over there. They still do. Look at the fucking Hasty Pudding Club, where they all get together and put bras on and giggle. They love that shit. They love the fake dramatic, the amateur dramatics of it. And so the idea of, oh, we're going to burn a fire in front of this stone owl coming down, and oh, it's very droll. Oh, we're having such a fun time. By the way, there's also a fucking talent show at Bohemian Grove at the last night of it, like fucking summer camp. Richard Nixon called it the F-wordiest thing he'd ever seen on the Nixon tapes. But so that's it's an expression of the kind of class they're part of. But of course, regular people don't have those frames of reference. So when they see a sacrifice in front of a stone owl, they see a fucking sacrifice in front of a stone owl. Like, holy shit, these guys are doing ritual shit. They're actually supernaturally connected. They're fucking channeling dark forces to rule over us for the benefit of like the Satan or something. So that made Alex Jones's career. And that sort of narrative was the pervading narrative of the Chris Carter 90s. And all of that kind of went along in this anxiety about, oh, are we being, what's happening? Are we being turned into sheeple? Are we turning into sheeple? Oh, my God. And all of that navel gazing, it all ended one beautiful September morning in 2001. 9/11 was the biggest event that had happened in the lifetime of most people living in America. Something that big, by definition, has to have correspondingly massive causes. And due to racism and also just the fact that, frankly, it's not traditionally a very impressive enemy. I mean, the country that fought the Nazis being told that this horrible Pearl Harbor-style attack is the work of a shadowy network of non-state actors who we can't meet in open battle, that's a fucking bummer. Even forgetting the racism of just people thinking there's no way that those people could pull this off. So those forces, plus another classic thing of conspiracy thinking, is that people observed, wow, 9/11, that sure did help the Republicans. Holy shit, they're really taking advantage of this. Oh my God, we're invading Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. It's almost like they had that in their back pocket the whole time. Oh, what's this? This organization that's filled with people who are now staffing that administration is talking about how we need a new Pearl Harbor to make American policy go in our direction. Wow, somebody sure benefited from this. And from that central insight, they work backward to make the evidence fit. And that's like the true existence of U.S. intelligence agency skullduggery, this redounds to make conspiracy theory more credible, because 9/11 was a huge boon to the neoconservative project. There's no way to argue it wasn't. The only thing to do is just to try to work from the evidence rather than from the top down. And remember, one very important thing to remember when you're trying to evaluate these claims is, how would things be different if 9/11 was an inside job? Would it have changed anything else about the political reality that we face? And it really doesn't. It wouldn't change a damn thing. So it's one of those things where it's a literal distraction, because it's describing something that's not central to the processing of history and of the human fate. Okay, so with Bush in the White House and the conservatives riding tall in the saddle, conspiracy theory in the aughts was largely left-wing, broadly, but not even specifically left-wing, trutherism. That was the locus of left-wing conspiracy thinking. Was all about 9/11. And the conservatives have nothing to complain about. The world made sense to them. They were finally winning. They were going to remake the world in their image. There was going to be a fucking California pizza kitchen in every country in the world. And then it all went to shit. The Bush administration lost all credibility, both here and abroad. And Barack Obama was elected president. And Barack Obama's election was generally a traumatic moment for the American lumpen reactionary. Just a bolt from the blue of nightmare. Their worst thoughts about what could have happened after Bush were exceeded. And I'd say, as bad as it would have been if Hillary had won, they kind of knew what it was like to hate Hillary. It was a long-standing hate. It was the parameters were well established. This hate for Obama just came out of the blue, and it was fucking unbridled. And it just unleashed this absolute frenzy, which was channeled by a bunch of different stuff, from the Tea Party to cultural hucksters like Glenn Beck, who became the Alex Jones of movement conservatism, as opposed to the Alex Jones of sort of vague white working class people who watch a lot of YouTube. And Glenn Beck, on his show during the Obama years, where he would put out his massively convoluted web of actors, all of whom were conspiring behind the scenes to turn Barack Obama's presidency into some 1,000-year progressive Reich, involving all of these little-known thinkers like Saul Alinsky and Francis Fox Piven, enacting this decades-long plan. He is just basically opening up your grandpa's head and shining a light in there and just showing you what's going on. Like, this is what your dad's brain looks like now. That is what Glenn Beck was doing. And so people loved watching it. It was absolutely riveting. And in this new era, this new right-wing era of conspiracy thinking, if it's not Obama directly, who's behind Obama? And the answer is not the Jews. I guess this is what you would call a cultural progress. It's not the Jews. It's a Jew, a specific Jew, George Soros, who embodies all of the classic tropes of the alien scheming Jew who wants to destroy the world just to destroy it, who's the damn Joker. And that's always what it is, but it used to be Jews as a race. Now it's one guy, one specific Jew. So now you can't call him an anti-Semite because it's all been concentrated into one dude, George Soros, who wants to destroy the world for no reason, just like the Jews would have wanted to. A guy who is a billionaire fucking currency trader who is incredibly wealthy and has only pursued wealth his whole life. No, he's going to blow up the world for no fucking reason, just because he's not one of us. So that's what Soros is. They've perfected the anti-Semitism by channeling it into just one guy. And that really is the difference when you talk about, like, what's the difference between the anti-Semitic and the non-anti-Semitic right? Is it Soros or all the Jews? That's the only difference. All right, so all of this is leading to the current moment in which the spread of social media has proliferated conspiracy theory thinking in a way that is almost unprecedented. It's like it aerosolized conspiracy theory. Put it in the fucking drinking water, in the goddamn air ducts. We're all exposed to it every moment of the day. It settles on us like fucking radioactive dust. That is what conspiracy theory is with the supercharger of social media. So now we're in a post-Iraq War, post-2008 collapse world where all institutional faith is gone. No one has any trust of institutions, public or private. Nobody believes the media. Nobody believes any politician except the one that they have a personal emotional connection to and says the words that trigger their limbic systems. So we are now more primed than ever for funneling the world into a conspiratorial mindset. And that is what we have been doing like gangbusters. We know that the libs have, of course, grasped Russiagate as their shibboleth. That is their explanation. Putin replaces Soros for them as this figure. It makes a little bit more sense because in that one, Putin at least wants to take over the world, to rule it. He doesn't just want to destroy it. So points for coherence on that. But other than that, it's the same gibberish. More interestingly, though, we have on the right Pizzagate and QAnon, which is an amazing example of boomers finding the internet. This is taking the blueprints that they saw on the Glenn Beck's chalkboard and using them as coordinates to pilot a journey onto the information superhighway that we'll never forget. And so there's two things about social media that hyper-viralize conspiracy theory. One is the decentralized nature of the information and the way that it flattens all sources of information so that especially for a boomer who grew up getting the authoritative news, capital N, from Walter Cronkite, he goes to patriotgun.eagle. He gives it the same mental weight. So that is one element of social media that spreads conspiracies very well. The other is gamification, because social media isn't just watching a video, isn't just looking at a meme. It's posting a meme. It's posting comments. It's writing on Twitter. It's doing hashtags. It's harassing the bad guys and cheering on the good guys. It's engaging. And by engaging in it, you are able to make it a game. You're trying to rack up points, faves, retweets, all that. But also, you are making the game as it happens. You are interacting with it. You are the investigator. It's not just watching Glenn Beck. You're up there with Glenn Beck, writing stuff on the chalkboard with him. You've turned it into a game. You can find the evidence. You can look at the clues. You can put the clues together. And you now know. It's like watching Blue's Clues, where you're yelling at them. No, it's the rake, and then they'll go, yay, and it's like, I'm helping. That's what you get to do. So those are big components of why QAnon and Pizzagate are so popular. But the other big ones are, one, the fantasies of the extreme depravity of your enemies in it. They're not even just worshiping Satan. They're actually eating babies' brains while they're alive. Some of this stuff about adrenochrome and all that shit, the theory is the kid has to be alive when you're eating it so you get all of his life power. When your enemies are like that, you are justified in doing anything to them. And so this is psychologically for these super reactionary right-wing people. They're giving themselves justification for what they want to do to them. They're justifying their authoritarianism. Remember, QAnon is just a fantasy of a coup. All of it. The whole point is we're counting down the day until they just arrest all of the political opposition in government and in civil society, which is a fucking coup by any definition. But they have justified it because, no, they're eating baby brains. I'd say, but the most crucial and interesting thing that it represents, and I think, frankly, seeing how authoritarian they are, this is a little bit comforting, is that this model of political engagement is defined, as all of these conspiracy theory mindsets are, by inaction, by powerlessness. You are, even though you're engaging with the game, you're engaging with the evidence, maybe, if you're a QAnon person. You are, at the end of the day, spectating. You are watching a thing unfold. You are watching the plan of the white hats and the good Trump people play out. And you can yell at the screen like you're watching Blue's Clues, and that makes it more fun, but it is essentially a spectacle. And that is the end point of American political engagement, is to realize the degree to which politics is fundamentally a spectacle in which the average person has no ability to interact in a meaningful way. There's no input that they can put into this thing that's going to get anything resembling their will coming out of it. The voting won't work. Mobilizing won't work. that just the sense people have that there is no changing this, there's no shaping any of this, we are absolutely in the thrall of this spectacle, then we might as well fucking enjoy it instead of swimming against the current and trying to fantasize that we're even pushing anything in any direction. We can just watch it and we can root for the white hats. The unsealed. Oh, they're going to unseal the indictments. It's happening. Oh my God, we're going to do it. There's no difference. That is the end point. That's the final disillusioned end point of participation in American politics. Is realizing its uselessness and embracing your own position as a totally powerless spectator who just wants a better show. You want to see an example of the powerlessness at the heart of QAnon? Take the case of Vincent Fuchsia. So Vincent Fuchsia was this guy who was just going to Trump rallies in a Santa costume. And one day some Q guy took a picture of him and I guess using some seeing stones and a hat or something decided that he actually looked like JFK Jr. And soon, totally outside of the prompting of Q himself, all by their own, these little detectives create a narrative where John F. Kennedy Jr. faked his own death in a plane crash in the late 90s in order to go into hiding and investigate his father's assassination, which he eventually was able to connect to George H.W. Bush. And then eventually he worked behind the scenes to help elect Trump, is now working behind the scenes with Trump to defeat the deep state. It's just an amazing tale. I mean, you just sit back and you're like, holy crap. And they even created a whole theory where George Magazine was originally supposed to help launch Trump to prominence, and that there's a quote in one of the editions where John F. Kennedy Jr. is saying how great a president Trump would be, and that all people would understand and agree that he is the leader that they were seeking. Just, John the Baptist shit. And so now their story is every time they see this dope show up at one of these rallies, they're like, oh my God, it's him. And just think about that for a second. So this is their ideal narrative, right? This is an action hero narrative where this guy goes undercover, man in the iron mask, like fucking gets plastic surgery, skulks around to get revenge for his father's death against these deep state sickos. So what does he do when the trap is about to be sprung? He just starts going to the fucking Trump rallies. This guy who went through all of that trouble to do this thing, this multi-decade plan, and now part of it is to, at the 0 hour, reveal himself in public and just hang out at the exact same fucking suburban gymnasium with the same room full of dentists and auto body dealership owners, and listen to this guy talk about how he almost had sex with Courtney Thorne Smith at an ESPN zone. And that's the same thing you're doing. He's just watching the same thing you're watching. Even at this vital moment, your key guy is not doing anything. He's just watching the president do something. But like I said, that is all related to the essential powerlessness at the heart of conspiracy thinking. That's one of my two big theses about conspiracy thinking is that, one, it's about being powerless and then expressing a political imagination around that powerlessness as its basic premise. But the opposite of conspiracy theory thinking is class solidarity, class consciousness, thinking in class terms that clarifies all the mysticism and makes the array of forces much more coherent, and it just makes everything make sense. It really is the glasses from They Live. And this gets to a reason why I don't think the left can be ever really successfully harness the energy of conspiracy theory. I've had people tell me, look, if conspiracy theory is a way people understand language in this atomized America, and most Americans are atomized, wouldn't it be easier to try to get to them through the conspiracy theory than by trying to create a class consciousness that's not there? It's the easy way. Just go around the corner. Just be like, hey, you like conspiracy theories? Well, what about the conspiracy called capitalism? And I see the lure of that, but I think it's a dead end because conspiracy theory is the antithesis of consciousness. What conspiracy theory is, it is what fills the space left where America's class consciousness should be. the degree to which class consciousness is missing in America, the hole, the sucking void, is filled with conspiracy theory. So the reason for this is that every exploited worker, and that's the majority of people in any culture, including the mass majority of people who believe deeply in conspiracy theories, experiences alienation. So it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter if you're a nationalist, if you're a Republican, if you're a Protestant, however you stack the deck of your synapses and decide that's a personality, you are feeling alienated from your labor because you are being alienated from your labor. That's not a subjective experience. It is an objective phenomenon, and the body responds as it would, because having your surplus value expropriated is inherently alienating. It feels bad. You're not in control of your life. You're not in control of your livelihood. It creates hostility, resentment, and the sense of frustrated powerlessness. And that's true of whatever you believe on your surface of your mind. However much of a real, true believing capitalist you think you are, you're still having that alienation. And ideology is what you use to direct the resentment and hostility you feel. And at base, class consciousness is just people comparing notes about their sense of alienation. It's about people in the same workplace working closely saying, hey, our boss is such a piece of shit. You think the boss sucks too? Oh, God, he's awful. Oh, you know what? I was just thinking that. I didn't know if anybody else thought that either. And you just all find out that, oh, we all have the same source of alienation and angst. We all are feeling bad for the same reasons. We know who's responsible. And it's the guy taking our fucking labor. And that's how unions begin. It's just people comparing notes at their workplace about their feeling of exploitation. Now, Americans, especially after World War II, and that's when our modern conspiracy culture was formed, thanks to mass media and the suburbanization, we lost touch with each other as workers. We stopped comparing notes. The big factories that have always been the engines of the working class, wherever they sprout, broken up, shipped to other countries, shipped to right-to-work states, even before that. Working class communities broke up with urban renewal, segregation, and suburbanization. Mass media filling the void left by socialization. And instead of socializing with your fellow workers, you're socializing with actors and performers, all of whom are on the side of capital and are reproducing capitalist notions for your consumption. That all fills the space where that conversation once was that leads to class consciousness. And because of this, American workers, they can only process their alienation internally. They can only ask their own self what's going on. They are ill-equipped to identify the real cause of the distress because they don't have the notes to compare. They can't talk to others and make these conclusions. All they have is their own single perception and their own head full of pre-existing notions. Their subjective experience, filtered through a lifetime of personal prejudices, religious belief, and incredibly crucially exposure to that mass media I was talking about, that takes the place of collective note-taking. And so that turns our alienation into a story, like the stories we watch in movies and TV. Stories with beginning, middle, and end, identifiable villains and heroes, sense, reassurance, immortality, really, because you're at every part of the story. You're there. At no point do you die as the person observing it. And that's why conspiracy theory is inherently reactionary, and it really can't be used for leftist ends, because that is antithetical to keeping yourself in the dream. To keeping your ordered universe sense together. People say, go to the flow. Just use the stories to point to the real enemy. But the thing is, they will always replace capitalism with something else. I mean, look at Pizzagate. That's the perfect example, because you guys know I am on the hobby horse, and I think Pizzagate is fundamentally correct in its contours about elite child predation. But the actual theory of Pizzagate, it's all built on just brain detritus, just reactionary cultural anxieties about degeneracy and its relationship to the Democratic Party, just personal prejudices, local bias curdling into this thing that totally taints it. And so Trump's hand in the real life Pizzagate, fucking Jeffrey Epstein, is totally ignored. Unwinding all the way back to unwinding all those premises is way harder than I think appealing to people on a material basis is. So I'd rather really try to hit people in the breadbasket than try to go all the way back to try to deprogram and debug all those lines of cultural code. Because, I mean, take a look at the evidentiary gap between what we know about Pizzagate crimes and we know about Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. In Jeffrey Epstein's case, we have dozens of not only witnesses, but victims who have testified under oath about what he did to them, who have given them information that only someone who was intimately familiar with him could have had. One of the girls who he abused, when they searched his house, they found one of her high school report cards in his fucking house. You have victims, you have evidence, and you have Donald Trump's name on a fucking flight log and a quote bragging about how much he likes partying with Jeffrey Epstein, how much Jeffrey Epstein likes young girls. Who are the victims at Pizzagate? There's not a single purported victim in Pizzagate, except for Madeleine McCann, which is just a total wackadoodle flyer on their part. There's no victims. There's no evidence at all. It's all just imputed. It's what it is. It's decoding. It's decoding the messages in the DNC emails, like you're fucking using your decoder ring to find out if you should drink your Ovaltine in a 50s kids radio show. It just defangs the whole thing. And now take Alex Jones before he became just a boring Republican. From the days when he was a real live wire, his famous line is, "They're putting chemicals in the water to turn the frogs gay." Of course, that's hilarious, right? Everyone has a good fun with that. That's stupid. His thinking is that there's some sort of evil company who's working to make men, to change gender roles, to undermine the traditional family, starting with the frogs. That's the idea, you fucking idiot. Well, the thing is that at the base of that claim, they're putting chemicals in the water that turns the frogs gay. That's based on truth. There's a paper that has studied frogs exposed to a pesticide called atrazine, in which the exposure to the pesticide has caused mutations in their gender expression and led to cases where they've changed sex or become sterilized. Now that's a great example of capitalism at its worst. This fucking pesticide is used because it increases crop yields and it's therefore increases profits. And any damage to the people or the environment in which it's expressed, that's an externality that they don't have to deal with. That is just a perfect parable of capitalist exploitation. But he has to fucking frame it around cultural anxieties and obscure the truth. The fucking capitalist motive at the heart of turning the frogs gay. You turn the frogs gay because it's cheaper to use this fucking pesticide than the one that's not going to turn the frogs gay. That's it. It doesn't require lizards or Jews or aliens with a 10,000-year plan to get rid of gender. But that's the whole lure of the thing, because you're telling somebody a story they want to hear, and the part they want to hear is that they don't have to do anything, that they just have to keep watching. Why do they want the frogs gay? Tune in next week. We'll reveal why they want the frogs gay. Oh, it turns out that there were these reptilians who wanted to make the frogs gay. But then there's this other new random race of reptilians who have now come to Earth and are now fighting for control using false flag attacks. You can embroider the thing forever, and it'll always be an entertaining journey, and you'll never get any closer to actually understanding politics, coming together with fellow citizens to fucking try to make the world a better place. You will just amuse yourself to death. And I will leave you guys with one chilling note. I know I just said that conspiracy theory is the province of powerless people who need a way to cope with and express their powerlessness. But there is one way that conspiracy theory can actually be mobilized to political goals as opposed to just the observation of politics playing out. And that is, this takes us back to the 1920s. This takes us back to the rise of fascism. Because right-wing populism requires an analysis of social dysfunction and an enemy just as much as as leftism does. But that enemy can't be capital, as we've discussed, because they're committed to maintaining capital. That's their path to power. They can get the people onto the streets by denouncing the material conditions of their lives, but they maintain the support of the elite, their money, and their freedom from police abuse by protecting capital and not pointing towards capital. And so that's where you put conspiracy theory. That's you put in the end, a flex capacitor there of fascist worldview is the fucking conspiracy theory. Look at the white genocide, great replacement narrative that's powering the far right now. Okay, now every single component of what these people are claiming is a conspiracy about great replacement, about replacing the white race. These are all 201 processes powered at every point by broad global economic trends created by capitalism and the specific decisions of the ruling class policymakers of the capitalist regimes. So all these effects, so all the stuff they're talking about, millions of people being driven from their home countries to seek economic and physical security. That also includes dropping birth rates in the West, because it's pretty well established that the degree to which you have a advanced capitalist state is the degree to which women taking control of their reproductive destinies have fewer and fewer children. That is an established connection. So these are all things that are phenomenons of capitalism one way or another and can be explained by capitalism. You got NAFTA. Climate change caused droughts. U.S.-backed coups and civil wars. And all of these things have done the same thing. All of them have created this milieu of population migration and baby gaps. But this is another case where people coming to these decisions themselves, not comparing notes in a context of class awareness, are filtering this reality through their pre-existing racial anxieties and their dreads of the other. And so when they see these things, the villain that comes up is once again one carrying out pointless destruction for inscrutable alien purposes. Because the Jews want to replace us. Why? Why do the Jews want to replace us? What does that even mean, replace us? They're here too. They're here as much as they want to be. And according to these guys, they control all of the money. Their lives are awesome. Probably couldn't really even get any better. Why? Who do they want to replace us with, and why? They're Jews. They hate your culture. They hate its rootedness. They're jealous of it, and they don't want to look at it anymore. They want to destroy it. They want to destroy a civilization that they hate because they can never be a full part of it. That's it. And so that narrative then coheres and then is expressed in that cesspool of the internet that sends these things out with no friction coming in any way from anybody else's experience or humanity. All that gets drained out of it. And it becomes now hardwired in the minds of a lot of young reactionaries in this country in a way that is now politically valent because it's being expressed by a political party, like the anti-Masons. Like, we're returning to that era because of the viral nature of memes and information over the internet. So among the leaders of these movements, there is no interest in confronting the reality that capitalism is driving us all to a breaking point. And the only way that we can defeat them, defeat the ruling class, is by uniting around our exploitation, by bringing together the expressed and exploited people of the world together and use the power of our numbers to overthrow them and to reorganize society to the benefit of all. They don't want to talk about that because although that is the only way we survive, doing it requires crossing a chasm of otherness to a person who is in some way different culturally, religiously, ethnically. And the mere thought of making oneself vulnerable in that way, of attempting to make the leap of faith and express the vulnerability to try to create solidarity across these divisions that, though arbitrary, are in the minds of someone conditioned in 20th century America incredibly powerful. Because that thought is too horrifying to contemplate, these people have to turn it into a cabal of reptiles and globalists who are using this inhuman mass of people who aren't as good as us, actually, because if you look at FBI crime statistics and IQ, blah, 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 and they've severed their connections to other people because they would rather live in the fantasy. All right, well, that's it, I think. I hope some of this made sense. If this might have been divided into two parts, I'm not sure. But thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you guys in the funny pages.
Hello, folks. This is Matt Christman here, bringing you another edition of the Inebriated Past, a Independence Day edition, and fittingly, we're going to talk about the American party system, and specifically how the American party system has evolved and its relationship to everyone's favorite document, the United States Constitution. And the main argument I'm going to be making today is that there is a fundamental conflict between the constitutional system of government that we have been bequeathed by our genius founding fathers and the party system that has arisen to work within it. And the thing that made me think about this, and the thing that made me think it was worth talking about, really was that hilarious quote that Joe Biden had a few weeks ago about James Eastland, the monstrous, racist, segregationist Mississippi senator who he was in the Senate with in the 70s. The quote is, if you've forgotten it, "I know the new left tells me that this is old-fashioned, but guess what? If we can't reach a consensus in our system, what happens? It encourages the demands the abuse of power by the president. That's what it does. You have to be able to reach consensus under our system, our constitutional system of separation of powers. I was in a caucus with James O. Eastland. He never called me son. He always called me boy. The point I'm making is you don't have to agree. You don't have to like the people in terms of their views, but you just simply make the case, and you beat them." So everyone got mad at him, obviously, because he was praising a monstrous, horrifying racist who spent his entire career in government trying to prevent black Americans from reaching any kind of statutory or social equality. And obviously that is true. But I want to point to a different thing about this quote that I think is even more in its way revealing, not just about how Biden is a fossil who does not realize what's happening and doesn't understand the political world that he's in anymore, but how the conventional wisdom of, I would say, the vast majority of people in Congress, in government, at all levels, and certainly in the journalism sphere and in the punditocracy, understand politics. The thing that is important about that quote is the thing about Eastland is that he was a Democrat. Biden is talking about the need to reach across the aisle and to get to do the kind of brass tacks compromise that gets things done. But he was talking, when talking about Eastland, about a fellow member of the Democratic Party, which he was also a member of at the time and still is. And that shows that he does not understand how things have changed, specifically in the last 10 years, since the Obama administration, really, since about 2008, 2009. It fails to recognize that the era of compromise that he is hearkening back to, and that so many establishment political figures are hearkening back to, was made possible by the existence of having two ideologically incoherent political parties. Back then, the parties were not really divided by a hard line of ideology. It was much more divided by interest coalitions and specifically geographical coalitions. And that we live now, for the first time really in American history, in an era of totally ideologically polarized parties, where the parties are not divided by region. They are divided, but broadly speaking, by ideology, or, if you would prefer, by distinct coalitions of interest groups that are in conflict. In a system like that, or in a structure like that, where the parties exist in that state, the constitutional system of government that we have, with the checks and balances, with the three branches, all the shit you learned in junior high, in that system, meaningful cross-party compromise is impossible. In fact, the constitutional structure of the federal government makes any legislative function impossible, because it was designed only to work in a system that did not have factional government. That's not me saying that. That is what the founders said at the time. That's what the Federalist Papers said. They said, yeah, this is clearly going to be fucked if factions ever emerge, but it's okay because factions won't emerge. Well, it's now over 200 years later, and we can say with confidence, factions fucking emerged. And this fact, this reality, is something that everyone needs to reckon with to understand where we are and how we can possibly move forward. So I want to start by talking about that document that we all know and love, the beautiful, beautiful parchment that we worship, the one that we're all going to be giving our come tributes to tomorrow on the 4th. That's right, the United States Constitution. Now, the Constitution, as many of you probably know, I would hope, was not the first attempt by the founding fathers, once they defeated Britain, to create a system of government for the erstwhile colonies. There were first the Articles of Confederation, which attempted to create a radically decentralized system of authority with an incredibly weak central government and most power vested in the states. Because one of the foundational realities of American politics is that, and the thing that we have had to deal with ever since, is that the unit of the United States, when it was originally emerging out of its war with its colonial benefactor, the United Kingdom, was that the states had very distinct interests and identities, which meant that the job of creating a nation out of it was really the job of knitting together what felt really more like separate nations than departments, the way that there are departments in France or in the UK. And the first attempt to do that was the Articles. The United States under the Articles was an unwieldy system that, for one thing, had debt from the war era unequally spread throughout the former colonies, different currencies, different trade concepts, and most importantly, different states with different economic structures and systems that were not knitted into a whole and therefore couldn't function as a whole. And so the Constitution came out of the effort to knit these things into a more cohesive whole for these individual states to give up some of their authority in exchange for a more centralized control that allowed for, you could argue, the emergence of finance capitalism, all that stuff with Hamilton, the consolidation of war debt, and all the things that led to the emergence of America as a finance-dominated nation. But because there was no gun at the head of anyone, basically, there was no coercion that was going to work, because everyone really did have the authority. All these states didn't really have anything on one another because they did see themselves as separate. It had to be a negotiation. And so the Constitution emerged as the effort to prevent these states from ever feeling overawed or controlled by any of the other states. And that's the important thing, is that the people writing the Constitution, when they looked at the conflicts that had to be assuaged by the system of government they were creating, the chief ones they were thinking of were specifically state-based, region-based, but even more specifically state-based. And as such, that's why you have things like the Senate and the House of Representatives, this elegant system where small states are able to gain some sort of foothold on power by virtue of the Senate, whereas larger states still have influence because of the population-based House of Representatives. So that was all an effort to prevent any of one state from feeling overawed by another. And then, of course, there's the checks and balances that they love to talk about, the three co-equal branches of government, designed to prevent any one power from becoming over-powerful. A president from becoming overpowerful, a legislature from becoming overpowerful, a judiciary from becoming overpowerful. And the thought was that the dangers that needed to be checked against by these by this document were the dangers of some states ganging up on other states in some way, or of one branch of government overawing another branch of government. And we're taught that this system was a beautiful and elegant solution for those problems. And at the time, it appeared to be so, and it has worked to a degree. the whole sectional issue ended up in a fucking bloody civil war that killed over 500,000 Americans. So even on its own terms, honestly, the United States Constitution wasn't great shakes. The real issue is that all of the elegant checks and balances that are in the Constitution fail completely if government becomes based on coherent and disciplined parties. The checks and balances we were talking about that prevent one branch of government from overawing the others and maintain a system where there's accountability for all, those fail if one faction controls all the branches, which we have now. We've spent the last 3 years watching agog as all of these norms and all of these checks and systems that are supposed to prevent a manifestly corrupt oaf from just doing whatever the fuck he wants without any kind of reckoning have failed to engage. And why? Because a ideologically coherent party that is allied with that president is also in control of the other branches of government, which means that it will never be in their interest to see him held to account, and therefore he won't be. So the checks and balances out the window. Why? Because there's an ideologically coherent party that controls all the branches. And the things that make the government work, the things that allow it to be responsive, the things that allow it to pass laws in the face of crises and in the face of issues and respond to the popular will, those things fall apart if the different branches of government are controlled by different political parties that are ideologically coherent and have discipline, as was the case during the Obama administration after 2010, when Mitch McConnell and the Republican House made it essentially impossible for Obama to govern, and he wasn't able to. Now, the people who wrote the Constitution and patted themselves on the back thinking they'd solved all these issues, they didn't imagine that these would ever come up, even though they were built into the framework itself, because they did not see the real divide being between interest groups that would have a stake in government. The only real divide they saw was, as I said, between state interests, but the other real one, the one that they were counting on preventing the system from breaking down and from these sort of factions to emerge, was the one between rich and poor, the haves and have-nots. And they were very explicit about this, that the government they were creating was one that was designed to essentially lock the poor out of influence of government, to have minimal to no interest in government. People forget this, but universal manhood suffrage did not exist in most U.S. states until well into the 19th century. And that the original idea for the Electoral College was that there would be no popular vote involved in it at all. State legislatures would meet and appoint electors, and then they would go together and elect a president. There would be no system in which they would be forced to vote for any specific candidate the way they are now, where a state, their popular vote winner in a state determines how their electors must vote. That wasn't the original conception, which is always funny when you see people trying to defend the Electoral College on the grounds that the brilliant founders had this idea that we should honor because of their wisdom. We are already violating that by binding electors to the will of their state's population. At first, they were supposed to just get in a room and hash it out. There was no place for the commoner to vote there. And the House of the Commons, the House of Representatives, the people who could vote in elections for those offices and could vote for the state offices that then elected the senators at that time, was a very constricted franchise. It was constricted by property ownership in the vast majority of states. It varied from state to state. Some states had broader franchises. Some states had much more restricted ones. Rhode Island had a notoriously restrictive franchise. Pennsylvania had a relatively more open one. None of them were anything that we would recognize as universal, forgetting of obviously the fact that women and Native Americans and blacks were not allowed to vote. Even among white males, the franchise was restricted because the people who created the Constitution wanted it that way. And so in their mind, the factions that would make the system they'd created impossible to work wouldn't emerge because everyone within government would be of the same essential class. They would all be ruling class broadly construed, and they would therefore be able to look out for the common interest, which of course was synonymous with their class interests. And so that was the conception of the Constitution, that it was designed to keep the great beast, as Hamilton called the regular Americans, away from the levers of power, and to allow the ruling classes of the respective states to gentlemanly work out their conflicts in a way that prevented any one of them from becoming too powerful. But what they didn't realize, and they should have, honestly, is that even within a ruling class, there are conflicting interests. And the funny thing is it's not like they even had to be terribly smart to think that. They could have just looked across the pond at the country that they were emerging from. Already, by the time the American Revolution had happened, the Parliament of Great Britain had within it political factions, the Whigs and the Tories. And they were divided broadly by what sort of ruling class they represented. The Tories were the party of the rural big landowners, the sort of feudal remnants, and the Whigs were the party of the emergent capitalist urban merchant class. And they were fucking daggers drawn. They were fighting all the time. And you would think that the American founders would have looked across, seen that, and thought, oh, what if that happens here? And instead, you look at the Federalist Papers, and they really just said, no, we're fine. And one of the big reasons for that, the reasons that they thought America would be an exception, is the same thing that is the answer to any question of what is exceptional about America. What is exceptional about America? It is not that we were magically sprinkled with the fairy dust of Athens and Jerusalem, like Ben Shapiro says, or that the spirit of John Locke impregnated the minds of men and turned them into these perfect subjects of liberal propriety. No. The reason America is exceptional, and the founders knew this, that they were grounded enough not to buy their own bullshit too much, is what Tim Heidecker would call free real estate.
It's free real estate.
The thing that makes America exceptional to all European powers, the thing that makes it its own thing, the thing that throughout its history has made America feel like a country apart, is the mere brute fact that there were always, for the vast majority of its history, endless amounts of land that could be taken from its native proprietors and then given over at basically no cost to white settlers. That reality is what shapes America's political institutions and political ideology and political imagination. Greg Grandin's new book, The End of the Myth, is very good on this, and I recommend it highly. That any kind of conflict that might have ground the gears of government to a halt would, in the minds of the founders, would always be assuaged eventually by westward movement. Class conflict, both within classes and between classes, would always be soothed by the fact that people could just pick up and move west. There was another native tribe to be expropriated from. There was more land to be given away. And as such, none of these conflicts would ever reach the point where they created a crisis of legitimacy or a crisis of functionality in the American political system. Now, even with that in their minds, very shortly after the establishment of the constitutional system, factions emerged. The Federalists and the Democrat Republicans pop up almost simultaneously with the establishment of the American government. And it really does turns out that what happens is that the different sectors of the ruling class could end up having conflicting policy interests. Oops. But the reality of that was at first masked by a geographic happenstance, which is that divide ended up largely being represented through states, in a way that was something that they had anticipated, because due to geography, due to richness of soil, and a whole bunch of factors, the South became a slave-based agricultural society, and the North quickly became a more urban, trade-based, and then after the Industrial Revolution, industrial-based capitalist social order. And so, even though sectional conflicts like those were anticipated by the founders, the Civil War still ended up revealing the whole thing to be incredibly brittle and incapable of managing even the factionalism that was built into it. that was assumed. It really is kind of astounding to think about. They had planned for that. They had planned for states having conflicting interests. And with less than 100 years of them establishing the system, there could only be a resolution of a conflict over slavery through an incredibly violent civil war. So once again, take a fucking bow, you powdered wig-wearing chumps. So after the Union won the Civil War, they sadly botched a real golden opportunity to really just fucking rip that shit up and start over again. To just, at the point of a gun, because they had a lot of them, and the South was prostrate, re-establish the basis of government. Sadly, they didn't. They settled for working within the parameters of the system. They added a few very good constitutional amendments, the usefulness of which, though, was incredibly predicated on who was in power at the time. But the most important thing about the Civil War is that it forged a post-war political order that defined the parties along sectional lines in a way that masked the fundamental dysfunctional system that the Constitution had created. Because after the Civil War, parties were broadly aligned along regional identity and not ideology. And that allowed for people to accumulate some very fucked up notions of how the system was supposed to work. Now, the system that emerged after the Civil War is the system that we have inherited today of two political parties, two major political parties that contest for power in basically every election, the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats, after the Civil War, were the party of the defeated South and also of the northern ethnic immigrant enclaves of, like, the East Coast, Boston, New York, etc. Whereas the Republican Party was the party of the yeoman northern farmer and the emerging middle class. And then at the very top, of course, the emerging industrialist powers were funding both of them. The most clear way to represent specifically how this was working is the fact that in the years after the war, almost every contested election was between a Republican from Ohio and a Democrat from New York State. It's actually uncanny when you look back. The Republicans were almost entirely former Union generals from Ohio, and the Democratic candidate was almost always a senator or governor from New York. That was because even the political base, the majority of the political base of the Democratic Party was in the South, but in the immediate aftermath of the war, it would not have been viable for a politician from the former Confederacy, from the treasonous Confederacy that had killed so many young men from the North, to contest for national power. They would have been easily defeated by what was known as waving the bloody shirt, which was a propaganda move that Republican politicians would engage in, where it was started, I believe, by Benjamin Butler on the House floor, where you would hold up a shirt stained with the blood of some young patriot who had fallen in the war and remind people of the essential treasonousness and perfidy of the Southerners. So there was no way, even though the vast majority of votes and electoral votes specifically that were going to be part of any Democratic winning coalition were in the South, the front man, the candidate running for president, had to be from the North. And because of New York City, because of the dominance of New York City, and because of the power of the Democratic machine in New York City, New York was where the Democratic Party was most powerful outside of the South. And so you had these generals from Ohio, the second most populous state in the North besides New York, the home to so many brave generals who had fought valiantly in the war, and fighting it out at the ballot box with these Democrats from New York. And that conflict, that regional conflict, went on. The battle was joined. The issue of Reconstruction was incredibly important. And meanwhile, the rising industrial capitalism that was coming out of the Civil War was doing its best to co-opt the entire political system and bring about the extravagance of capital accumulation and exploitation that we like to call the Gilded Age, leading to massive failure, massive dislocation, massive fall in living standards for regular Americans, misery, horror, even as these huge, monstrous Carnegie and Rockefeller fortunes were being made. And that is why when the progressive movement arose in response to this as a acknowledgement by the literate middle classes and the more enlightened capitalists of both parties that this was a fundamentally unstable situation, and that the failure to reform would inevitably lead to some sort of violent revolution. It was already one of the most violent labor movements the world had seen at that point in the United States. Labor violence in the U.S. made everything in Europe look like nothing comparatively. In both parties, a consensus around progressive reform emerged, which is why you had the situation where you had Teddy Roosevelt inaugurating the progressive era from the Republican Party, handing it off to Taft, who busted more trusts than Roosevelt did, and then the election of 1912, a conflict between Taft, Roosevelt coming back to try to reclaim the presidency with his new progressive party, and Woodrow Wilson, who was also proposing progressive reforms as a Democrat. And so you see that at this point, ideology is not really the defining feature of any of these parties. The votes are coming from regions. The ideology is bipartisan because everyone outside of the most fanatical capitalists understood that the system needed to reform, and therefore it did, along with both parties collaborating in doing so. So that's another thing where you had a crisis emerge, and the system, quote unquote, worked. It prevented revolution. It prevented the benighted working classes from coming together to overthrow it. But it did so in a way that required neither party to be coherent ideologically. Now, it's not to say that there was not friction within these parties that were held together through spit and baling wire. There really was. And the most intense moment of intra-party conflict that happened during this early 20th century era was the 1924 Democratic Convention. Now, as I said, the Democratic Party was an alliance between Southern whites and Northern white ethnics. Southern whites, almost entirely Protestant, Northern ethnics, largely Catholic. Now, there are significant cultural differences between these two groups, and those cultural differences also ended up being reflected in policy differences. The main one being the issue of prohibition in the 20s. Southern Protestant Democrats were dry. They endorsed prohibition. They wanted to see the evils of John Barleycorn banished from the land, and Northern Catholic ethnics vehemently opposed it, were wet. Drinking was part of their culture, be they Bavarian Catholics, Germans, or Irish, or Italians. They all drank, and they all wanted to keep drinking. And in 1924, that conflict came to a head when the two people at the top of the race for the Democratic presidential nomination were Thomas McAdoo, who had been Woodrow Wilson's Treasury Secretary, and New York Governor Al Smith. McAdoo was a Californian and a Protestant. Al Smith, the first Catholic to seek a major party nomination, a good Irish boy from the Bowery. In 1924, the Democratic National Convention met to pick a nominee in New York City at Madison Square Garden, and McAdoo supporters and Smith supporters from the jump were at daggers drawn over two main issues. One was prohibition. McAdoo staunchly supported it and wanted to maintain it. Smith ardently opposed. And the Ku Klux Klan, which during the 20s was at its zenith of influence, largely concentrated in the Democratic Party, although not entirely. Indiana was largely controlled during this period by a Republican machine that was also the Ku Klux Klan in that state. But one of the main tenets of the Klan was hostility to Catholicism. So the Northern Democrats were incredibly anti-Klan and accused McAdoo of being a secret Klansman. McAdoo denied being a Klansman, but not convincingly enough for many Northern Democrats. And what ended up happening was a complete shit show. They had ballots, they failed. They had ballots, they failed. They voted, they voted, they voted. They marched, they hollered, they fought. Fistfights on the floor of the convention were incredibly common. It ended up taking 108 ballots for the Democrats to finally land on a compromise candidate, John W. Davis, who went on to be absolutely destroyed by Calvin Coolidge in the fall election. But that just shows that, well, the regional nature of the party system prevented the constitutional system from breaking down and becoming non-functional. It had its own sublimated conflicts that ended up being fought in other arenas because it couldn't be fought at the actual level of government because, as I said, they were made up by these broad coalitions who shared power together when they held power, and as such, couldn't fight over these issues at that point, at that level. So now I want to talk about two distinct crises points in 20th century American history that were dealt with through two distinct types of party compromise and cooperation, both of which are pined after by people in Washington right now, and both of which are impossible in an era of ideologically polarized parties. The first was the New Deal. FDR came into power on the back of the complete failure of the Republican Party and Herbert Hoover to handle the crisis of the Great Depression. Democrats swarmed the House and the Senate, had massive majorities in both chambers, and ran the country. But of course, this was not an ideologically coherent party, as we said. It was made up of this motley arrangement of Northern working workers and increasingly Northern liberal professionals and Southern whites. And that meant that the New Deal could not be dictated by one side. It needed to be negotiated intra-partily. So that's one type of compromise that is being pined after. Intra-party compromise, where within one party, this being the Democrats who held power in all of the chambers, because the party was ideologically diverse, it needed to negotiate within itself how to do the New Deal. That wasn't just in terms of race. I mean, it's often talked about how FDR and the liberals had to sort of sacrifice racial justice on the altar of economic reform. And to a degree, that's true, but it goes beyond that as well, because while Southern Democrats did welcome the sort of broad reforms that FDR was in favor of, it must be remembered that the South was also dominated by local grandees and power brokers who had their own ideology and were hostile to organized labor in a way that party bosses in the North were not. And so that's another axis that had to be negotiated between the two parts of the coalition, the broad coalition of the Democratic Party. But the thing that needs to be remembered is that in a situation like this, where you hold the presidency and you hold the gavels in the chambers, this negotiation is not zero-sum. There can be a give and take, because either way, you're still in power. You hold these offices, you hold these seats. And therefore, within that party, there can be a non-zero-sum negotiation that gives both sides something in exchange for compromise on other things. So that's one sort of compromise that these people hearken to. And this is specifically what Biden was talking about when he was talking about Eastland. He was talking about this sort of intra-party compromise, which is totally superseded by the emergence of ideologically coherent parties. It is largely irrelevant, much more so anyway than it was then. And one of the real ways you can see that Biden has completely failed to realize how the ground has shifted underneath his feet by hearkening back to a model for compromise that isn't even really relevant anymore. The second example I want to talk about is after World War II, the Civil Rights Movement and the crisis caused by the civil rights activism that led inevitably to a cry for reform that was so overwhelming, so powerful, had such a huge grip over such a large percentage of the population who were willing to break the law, who were willing to defy authority in order to see justice done, that something had to give, if only to stop the Russians from making a big deal about it. At least that was JFK's thought. Now, in this situation, the civil rights movement, the intra-party compromise I talked about earlier is not as important because, well, Southern Democrats during the New Deal were willing to work with the North on a lot of these economic issues. They were absolutely not willing to compromise on civil rights. For them, this was a zero-sum game. The degree to which blacks in the South gained rights was the degree to which they and their constituents lost them. That was how they thought of it. So they were not going to be reconciled. And in the past, that had been the number one stumbling block to any kind of reform. That's why for the first half of the 20th century, the filibuster was almost exclusively used by Southern Democrats to prevent the bringing forth of civil rights legislation. And that was okay in a period when the pressure for civil rights was relatively muted. But once the civil rights struggle became pandemic, became overawing, became the domestic news story, the social crisis of the time, that couldn't happen anymore. And so now with the civil rights movement becoming the domestic crisis of the moment, the way that Southern intransigence was overwhelmed was through the second type of compromise that is longed for in Washington now, inter-party compromise. And so because the Southern Democrats were not going to move on it, what happened was that Northern liberal Democrats and Lyndon Johnson made a common cause with Northern liberal Republicans, which there were. As I said, there were tons of liberal Republicans at that time because in large parts of the North, you just voted Republican. You just weren't going to vote for a Democrat. It was a lingering effect of slavery. But that didn't mean that you were inherently reactionary. You very well might have liberal views on any number of topics. You were probably less sympathetic to the labor movement than Northern Democrats were, although not as probably more sympathetic to them than many Southern Democrats were. But on an issue like civil rights, you could very well be a liberal and be a Republican. And so the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the foundational pieces of legislation that cracked Southern segregation were passed by an inter-party coalition of Northern liberal Democrats and liberal Republicans, or at the very least moderate Republicans who, even if they were personally not that thrilled about the idea of government interference in the commerce, were even less thrilled about looking like a bunch of quasi-Nazis to the world during the Cold War. Now, the civil rights movement and the civil rights legislation of the 60s helped create the new world that we've been living in and that Washington has failed to comprehend, a world in which the conflict that was always implicit between a party political system and the constitutional federal governmental system is coming into focus and becoming salient. And that was ideological sorting, because the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, as we all know, and other things having to do with the crisis of the 60s led a exodus of reactionary Southern whites away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, led the Democratic Party to be associated broadly more with liberalism than with any kind of lingering regional affection, and the Republican Party being broadly associated with conservatism as opposed to any lingering thing having to do with the Civil War. And it took decades for this to play out. It didn't happen right away. It has to be reminded of that. The first real inkling of it happening was 1964 when the Solid South, which was called that because it was solidly Democratic for 100 years after the Civil War, cracked, and a number of Southern states voted for Barry Goldwater in 1964. It was furthered by Nixon and at the presidential level, but it didn't really filter down through to the congressional level until 1994. The Republican Revolution of '94, led by Newt Gingrich was in reality the last gasp of those Southern Democrats who had held on to their seats. They were finally replaced, almost en masse, by a new crop of ideologically galvanized Republicans. So finally, we have ideologically coherent political parties. Now, obviously, you can go too far in saying they're ideologically coherent. There is significant difference, in my view, between somebody, like Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren and someone like Joe Lipinski or Joe Biden, for that matter. But they're broadly speaking on the left. Republicans are broadly speaking on the right. And this was the first time that really held on a national level. And we're living in the aftermath of that reality. Now, like I said, it finally filtered through all the layers of government in about the early 90s. But even afterwards, the implications of that, I don't think, were really understood by anybody in government. One significant element of this is that the one group that had previously acted as the closest thing to an ideological backbone in the Democratic Party was the labor union movement, which had allied with FDR and held broadly held itself as the tentpole of the Democratic coalition, even with all of the reactionary Southerners, all through the 50s and 60s, into the 70s. The breaking of labor power after the crisis of the 70s meant that liberalism lost a economic raison d'etre. It became more cultural. And so you had sort of a cultural liberalism with a vague commitment to egalitarianism versus a Republican Party that was wholly committed to social and economic reaction. And the first person to really understand the implications of this was Mitch motherfucking McConnell. In his own way, he really is a genius, a dark, monstrous genius. Because while every other Republican saw the ass-kicking that they took in 2008, where they were routed at every level of government in a repudiation of the disastrous Bush administration, which had seen the horrifying war in Iraq and an economic collapse, the destruction of a major American city, most Republicans were ready to do what was generally the thing that the party out of power did when a new party came in. Reach across the aisle. Try to get some of that goodwill rubbed on them so that they weren't blamed. Make some deals. But McConnell realized something. McConnell realized that in an era of ideologically coherent parties, there is no benefit to compromising with the other side. There is no rational reason to give the party in power, by power I mean in the top office, being the party in power, the presidential party, giving the president a win on anything. There's no benefit to doing that. And because people will associate any success with him and his party. And any seats if any seats his party wins are seats that your party loses. So to the degree to which he is able to advance his popularity and his agenda and gain seats is the degree to which your party loses seats, loses the ability to influence policy. Their agenda is defeated. So there's no point to ever helping the party in power get any sort of policy through. The fear for many years was, if you look intransigent, the people are going to punish you. But what McConnell realized is that people don't pay that close attention, at least not enough of them do. If the president flounders, if the president fails to enact his agenda, people will blame him for it, especially if the economy is struggling. And they will do the only thing they can, which is reward the party out of power, even if they were the ones who made him not able to carry out his agenda, because there's nowhere else for them to do. There's nothing else for them to do. They can stay home, but that doesn't affect the final vote. Or they can do what most people who aren't ideologically committed, that narrow segment in the middle that often decides a lot of these cases, a lot of these races, they can vote. They can punish the president. They can punish the party in power by voting for the opposition. And that's you. If you're Mitch McConnell in 2008, that's you. And it fucking worked. 2010, the Republicans, after being a bunch of intransigent shitheads who actively worked to make the recession worse, who actively worked to make the health care reform that was passed worse, were rewarded with a huge swing in the House and recaptured the House. Now, the thing about it is that this was always the case. This flaw was built into the system because of the amount, the number of veto points that are set up inside the legislative system and the separation of powers between a president and Congress. A party that is unified and opposed to another party and holds power, holds positions of veto within these structures, can absolutely prevent anything from passing, can grind everything to a halt, even in the face of significant crises that need legislative action immediately. They can just say no, and they can be confident that that intransigence will be rewarded in the long term by people punishing the party that can't get things done by voting for them. This flaw within the system, this fundamental bug in the code of the Constitution, it was disguised for almost 200 years by the vagaries of geography and by happenstance of history, by the fact that regional distinctions ended up becoming more salient to the creation of political coalitions than ideological ones did. But that time is over. The 60s ended it. We now have largely coherent, ideologically consistent parties. There's a range within them, but there's a left and a right party, broadly construed. Obviously, this is within the very narrow bands of American electoral politics, but it's enough that parties in power understand, or at least the Republicans do, that reaching across the aisle, being bipartisan, making a deal is not in your interest. It is, in fact, irrational to do that. The rational thing to do is to refuse any and all compromise, wait for the whole thing to shudder to a halt, wait for the party in power to fail miserably, and then reap the victory in the form of protest votes for you. And then when you're in power, you can do what they've been doing ever since 2016, which is destroy all of the precious checks and balances between the branches that were lovingly crafted by the founders. Oh, the president's not going to be able to become a dictator. He's not going to be able to just do flagrant illegalities. Why? Congress will stop them. Why would Congress stop them? Oh, because Congress will see themselves first and foremost as representatives of that body, not as representatives of a party. Well, what if they see themselves first and foremost as members of a party and not members of Congress? Oh, shit, yeah, no, then it all goes to hell. Then the president gets to do whatever he wants. And that's where we are. We are now at the end of the road here, where ideologically coherent political parties can short-circuit the checks and balances that prevented overreach of power and corruption, and also have made reform literally impossible, have made it so that no compromise can be reached. So what can we learn from this? The thing we need to remember, listening to people fret during this election campaign about the need to be able to reach across the aisle, the need to be able to get things done in some abstract system, is impossible. It's gibberish. It is not. It doesn't relate to the actual functionality of the system we're talking about. This system can't work. The kind of reforms that are necessary to avoid environmental and social catastrophe in not even the long term, in the fucking medium to near term, are impossible. They cannot be obtained within this system. It was designed specifically to prevent these things from happening. It was designed to be a playground for the upper class to negotiate between themselves. The introduction of mass party democracy and ideologically coherent political parties has upended that and essentially switched a master flip, a fail-safe within the constitutional system to prevent the great beast from holding any power. And so all this talk about getting things done, about reaching across the aisle, about how important it is to have well-developed wonk policies, it's all irrelevant to the incentive structure of parties in power, especially when you consider the decades-long Republican effort to entrench their disproportionate minority power through gerrymandering in the courts. What this means is that any electoral strategy to overcome the system will have to be premised on a completely new strategy. It cannot be premised on piecemeal reform and reaching across the aisle and making deals. Deals are not to be had. The system must be overwhelmed by a unprecedented level of voter citizen engagement, which will then be coordinated, ideally, with a rise in labor militancy that can pressure government from the outside and shut down, if needs be, key sectors of the economy. And that is why it's important to remember, and if Bernie wins, which I am rooting for, obviously, I hope many of you are, if Bernie wins, it's got to be remembered, he will likely, in his time in office, not get much accomplished. He's not going to get Medicare for all, most likely. He's not going to get the student debt jubilee that we're talking about. He's not going to get the things that he's been envisioning. But every fucking wonk piece of shit who's pumping up one of these other gargoyles needs to shut the fuck up, because none of the rest of them will accomplishing anything either. Not with a disproportionately Republican Senate that, even if they're not in the majority, have levers of power within that body to prevent reform being there. They're not going to do it. The system has reached a point of critical failure. No Democratic president in office in the current parameters will achieve jack shit. But of those failures, which are all inevitable, as I said, only Bernie's failure has the potential to allow for the revitalization of a labor movement and a widespread disenchantment with the Democratic Party that could potentially lead to the sort of unprecedented, really, mobilization that will be necessary to successfully confront capital and successfully confront these sclerotic political structures that must be abolished. Change that is meaningful, change that can save us from the worst outcomes, is impossible in the current system. The current system must be abolished. So the only question for anybody who is still invested in any way in electoral politics is, what is the way forward that could bring about that final confrontation between an engaged and mobilized citizenry, ideally mobilizing around workplaces with vital functions to the economy, and this sclerotic talking house for plutocrats and their disgusting minions. All right, guys, that's been another Inebriated Cast. No, that's been another Inebriated Past with Matt Christman. Hope you have a good 4th of July.